The Commission will come to order, and I want to wish you all a very pleasant afternoon and welcome to this hearing as we inquire into the European refugee crisis and how the U.S., the EU, and the OSCE should respond. The Syrian displacement crisis that has consumed 7 countries in the Middle East has become the biggest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. At least 250,000 people have been killed in Syria's civil war, many of them civilians. The security forces of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, security forces have been responsible for many of these killings, targeting neighborhoods with barrel bombs and shooting civilians point blank. ISIS has committed genocide, mass atrocities and war crimes against Christians and other minorities, and likewise targeted, brutalized, and killed Shia and Sunni Muslims who reject its ideology and its brutality. Fleeing for safety, more than 4 million Syrians are refugees, the largest refugee population in the world, and another 7.6 million Syrians are displaced inside their home country. Syria's neighbors, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, and Egypt, are hosting most of these refugees. Before the Syria crisis, these countries struggled with high rates of unemployment, strained public services, and a range of other domestic challenges. Since the conflict began, Syrian refugees have become a quarter of Lebanon's population, and Iraq, which has been beset by ISIS and sectarian conflict, is hosting almost 250,000 refugees from Syria. Until this past summer, few Syrian refugees went beyond countries that border their homeland. Syrian refugees and migrants from a range of countries have since come to Europe in such large numbers and so quickly that many European countries, especially frontline entry points like Greece, transit countries like Serbia, and destination countries like Germany, have been challenged and even overwhelmed. The UN High Commission for Refugees, the UNHCR, reports that more than 635,000 refugees and migrants have arrived in Europe by sea in 2015 alone. 53% of these people are from Syria, 16% from Afghanistan, 6% from Eritrea, and 5% from Iraq. Notably, only 14% of them are women, 20% are children, and the remaining 65% are men. Pardon me. The European crisis requires a response that is European, national, and international, and the United States, we believe, is essential to it. There must be effective coordination and communication directly between countries, as well as through and with entities like the OSCE and the European Union. Individual countries also must have the flexibility to respond best to the particular circumstances in their own countries. The response must address push factors like economic challenges and aid shortfalls in countries like Syria's neighbors that have been hosting refugees. As a matter of fact, Shelley Pitterman from the UNHCR said that one of the triggers, if not the trigger, as he put it, the last straw for some, was the humanitarian shortfall, especially the World Food Programme's cut of 30% in recent months. There also, again, we must address the pull factors, like decisions individual European countries have made that have attracted refugees. There is real human need and desperation. We all know it, and that's why we're meeting. Refugees are entrusting themselves to smugglers, and where there is human smuggling, there's also a higher risk of human trafficking. I am especially concerned about the risk of abuse, exploitation, and enslavement of women and children. Already we are hearing reports that some European countries are failing to protect women and girls from sexual assault and forced prostitution. The lack of separate bathroom facilities, for example, for males and females, rooms that can be locked, and other basic measures enable such attacks. There is no excuse for such failures, and everything must be done to ensure that women and children are safe. There is also the real threat that terrorist groups like ISIS will infiltrate these massive movements of people to kill civilians in Europe and beyond. I'm deeply concerned that the screening at many European borders still, and again, this is a crisis that was thrust upon them, but remain inadequate, putting lives at risk. All of us must be responsive to the humanitarian needs without compromising one iota on security. European response plans should include specifics about strengthening security screening throughout the European region. During the conflict in Kosovo, I traveled to Stenkovic refugee camp in Macedonia. That, parenthetically, CRS was leading the effort there. And then was at the McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey later on to welcome some of the 4,400 people brought there to the United States, from there to the United States. One refugee, however, Argan Abdullahu, was apprehended and sent to jail in 2008 for supplying guns and ammunition to the Fort Dix Five, a group of terrorists who were also sent to prison for plotting to kill American soldiers at the Fort Dix military installation, also in New Jersey. Given Secretary Kerry's announcement in September that the United States intends to resettle at least 85,000 refugees in fiscal year 2016, including at least 10,000 Syrians, and at least 100,000 refugees in fiscal year 2017, the United States and Europe must be on high alert to weed out terrorists from real refugees. Because religious and ethnic minorities often have additional risks and vulnerabilities, even as refugees, they should be prioritized for resettlement. This hearing will examine the who is arriving, the why they are coming to Europe, and the what has been done and should be done in response. European governments, entities like the OSCE and the EU, religiously based entities and civil society all have critical roles to play. The United States has been a leading donor to the humanitarian crisis inside Syria and refugee crises in the region. We have also have the largest refugee admissions program in the world. However, according to testimony of Shelley Pitterman again, regional rep of UN High Commission for Refugees, we will soon, and we'll hear from him shortly, the current Interagency Syrian Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan for 2015, or the 3RP, is only 41% funded, which has meant cuts in food aid for thousands of refugees. Globally, he warns, the humanitarian system is financially broke. We are no longer able to meet even the absolute minimum requirements of core protection and life-saving assistance to preserve the human dignity of the people we care for. The current level of funding, and he goes on to say, for the 33 UN appeals to provide humanitarian assistance to some 82 million people around the world is only 42%. In other words, almost a 60% shortfall. UNHCR expects to receive just 47% of the funding they need in the next year. Again, this hearing will look at how the United States can best work with our allies in Europe to meet humanitarian needs and prevent security threats. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the United States and Europe have come together to address the great challenges of our time, and this is an opportunity to do so again. Before we begin, before I yield to Dr. Burgess, I'd like to recognize Ambassador Dr. Rika Semenki, who is present here in the room with us today, and thank you, Madam Ambassador, for joining us for this hearing. I'd like to now yield to Dr. Burgess. Then I will, Commissioner Pitts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank fellow commissioners and distinguished panelists and guests. I want to thank all of you for your participation here today on this hearing on Europe's refugee crisis. The term crisis does little justice to the dire situation that refugees are facing. The war in Syria, where more than half of the population has either been killed or displaced, has been raging for over 4 years now. The war's ensuing expansion and related brutality in neighboring countries have left millions of victims with no choice but to leave the lands that some groups have called home for thousands of years. Many have observed this to constitute the greatest migration and refugee crisis since World War II. And this is especially troubling when you factor in the relatively small scale of the populations and regions in conflict. However, the roots of this crisis go far beyond the war in Syria, as witnessed by the participants in the migration flows. People from across the Middle East, Africa, Afghanistan, South Asia, and even the Balkans are contributing to this mass exodus from areas of strife. Among them are economic migrants, refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless people. The numbers of migrants are increasing. It's estimated that over 500,000 have crossed into EU borders this year alone. Fatalities, too, are increasing at alarming rates, More than 3,500 perished in the Mediterranean last year, and this year possibly more than that will perish. The OSCE can play a unique role in addressing this crisis and help alleviate human suffering and mitigate related human rights abuses. The organization is uniquely equipped with tools, mandates, and a neutral framework that can help member states addressing an array of issues. With Russia's direct entrance into the war in Syria, the OSCE's neutral framework could be of great use in reporting in Syria and the surrounding region. Furthermore, its relationship with the UNHCR can be of great significance to U.S. interest, as we rely on that institution for information on our own domestic resettlement processes. I look forward to hearing about greater areas of cooperation in tackling this crisis. I want to thank all of the panelists here for their participation. We must not forget that people are dying. As the U.S., the EU, and OSCE debate this issue, we must not let fear be the greatest motivator of our responses. The United States and the West must offer a stark contrast to ISIS and the Assad regime and other governments or terrorists that wreak havoc on religious and ethnic minorities or other countless victims of human rights abuses that drive this crisis. We must carry a firm resolve that justice and charity is done under our watch. And I want to thank the chair again for holding this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Pitts. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you for having this hearing. I'll keep my remarks brief because the numbers have been very well stated by other people on the dais, but we all recognize the conflict in Syria is moving into its 5th year. The Islamic State controls large areas of both Syria and Iraq. Russia has now intervened militarily on behalf of the Syrian government, further exacerbating tensions among the armed resistance groups, terrorist insurgents, and those loyal to President Assad. These factors have contributed and created the staggering number of displaced persons that we're seeing, and at least 710,000 refugees have reached Europe's borders just this year. Syrians are the largest group by nationality. Most of them are hoping to reach Germany, Sweden, France, the United Kingdom, and many ultimately the United States. I think Chairman Smith said it very, very well when he gave you the breakdown of the numbers. And when you just look at the pictures of the people occupying the rail stations, awaiting transport to a different destination, yes, you see women, yes, you see children, but you see an awful lot of young men of military age who are fleeing. This raises questions in the minds of the constituents I represent back in Texas. Why is this particular subset of the population leaving so quickly, leaving so willingly, sacrificing the safety of their loved ones that they leave behind? Why aren't these individuals defending their country and giving access to women and children, the populations who may be most eligible for exploitation by the Islamic State? Why not give them the opportunity to leave first and to be safe? Are these young men leaving to avoid conscription, or worse, are they leaving to carry on the fight in other fronts? Recently, European countries pledged to accept increased number of Syrian refugees and other asylum seekers. In response, on September 20, Secretary of State John Kerry announced the refugee ceiling in the United States for fiscal year 16 would be 85,000. Previously, the administration announced that the United States would admit at least 10,000 Syrian refugees in fiscal year 16. Other reports that have come out have suggested that number could be as high as 100 or even 200,000, and I would just suggest to the State Department the differences in the discrepancies in these numbers are leading to a certain amount of unease for the constituents I represent back in Texas. Given the large and sudden increase in the admittance of refugees from one particular war-torn area, some would-be terrorists are bound to try to exploit any deficiencies that occur within the barriers that are set up to prevent their arrival in this country. And of course, as a member of the Commission, but also as a member of Congress, I have a constitutional obligation to have as my number one goal the defense of my nation, and I must not forget that responsibility. How much authority and control does the administration actually have over this process? And is Europe the first stop for these refugees implementing appropriate vetting processes so as before the individuals are moved elsewhere, particularly to the United States? I don't want to diminish the incredible hardship that these individuals have endured, but we must be certain that we aren't inadvertently admitting members of the Islamic State or other terrorist organizations into our country. I thank the chairman for convening this hearing. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses. Now I yield back.
Thank you very much, Dr. Burgess, and welcome. The Commission is very pleased to welcome Ann Richard, the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. Prior to her appointment, Ms. Richard was the Vice President of Government Relations and Advocacy for the International Rescue Committee, or the IRC. She also, and I'll put your full resume and that of all of our witnesses into the record without objection. But from 1999 to 2001, Ms. Richard was Director of the Secretary's Office of Resources, Plans, and Policy at the State Department from 97 to 99. She was Deputy Chief Financial Officer for the Peace Corps. Earlier, she served as a Senior Advisor in the Deputy Secretary's Office of Public Policy Resources at State and as Budget Examiner at the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith. Thank you, members of the Helsinki Commission, and for holding this hearing and for the opportunity to appear before you to discuss the refugee and migration emergency in Europe and the Middle East. I have just returned from a series of meetings overseas, including my 5th visit to Turkey and my 8th visit to Jordan in my tenure as Assistant Secretary. It's a very challenging situation, and I would like to briefly outline the steps taken by the Population, Refugees, and Migration Bureau and others at the State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development and in the Obama administration to help provide humanitarian assistance to innocent civilians and to assist the governments of other countries to deal with this crisis. As you know, in early September, the tragic photo of a little boy's body on a beach in Turkey awakened people to the plight of Syrian refugees in ways that years of grim statistics, bleak images, and climbing casualty figures could not. What started as unrest in Syria in 2011 has developed into a multi-front war and spilled over to become a regional crisis, and now the crisis has reached Europe as hundreds of thousands of young men, women, and sometimes entire families seek to reach that continent by boat, bus, train, and foot. They are joined by refugees and migrants from other countries, chiefly Afghanistan, Eritrea, and Iraq. They are taking pathways to Europe that migrants have always used, but the scale of this migration is much bigger than before and has caught the attention of the world. Americans want to understand what is causing the crisis, how we are responding, and what more we can do to help. While there has always been migration to Europe through Africa and across the Mediterranean, the numbers began to rise noticeably in mid-2013. Smugglers took advantage of the breakdown of law and order in Libya to profit from and exploit migrants and refugees desperate to reach Europe. The numbers have grown steadily. So far in 2015, more than 600,000 people have crossed the Mediterranean and Aegean seas to seek entry into Europe. Some come by boat from Libya to Italy. Others come the Western Balkans route from Turkey by boat to Greece and then onward. As the numbers of migrants have risen, so too have we seen an increase in the number of drownings and death. 3,200 people died in 2014 and more than 3,000 so far this year. Syrian refugees in Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon are losing hope of ever returning to their homes. They are worried about the reliability of food and assistance programs that are being reduced for lack of funds, as you mentioned earlier, Mr. Smith. They don't have regular work to sustain their families, rents are high, and their children are missing out on school. Today, an estimated 6.5 million Syrians are internally displaced, and nearly 4.1 million are refugees. More than half of these refugees are children. Along with the so-called push factors, what's going wrong that's pushing them out of the region, there are undeniable pull factors prompting individuals and families to make this trip. These include the summer weather, a perception that Europe was suddenly open to unlimited refugee arrivals, fear that the policy would change without notice and borders would close, and desire to join friends and relatives who had already made it to Europe. It is important for us to remember and acknowledge that the vast majority of Syrian refugee families, 96%, remain in the Middle East. The U.S. government is very much engaged in responding to the crisis and has been for some time. We have a three-pronged approach: strong levels of humanitarian assistance, and for this we have to thank bipartisan support from the Congress, active diplomacy, and expanded refugee resettlement. The U.S. government is a leading donor of humanitarian assistance to people in need inside Syria, in the surrounding countries, and to others caught up in crises around the world. Through contributions to international organizations such as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Committee of the Red Cross, the International Organization for Migration, the World Food Program, UNICEF, and leading non-governmental organizations, U.S. funds are being used to save millions of lives. On September 21st, the White House announced that the United States will provide nearly $419 million in additional assistance for those affected by the war in Syria. That was our last large announcement for that fiscal year. And this brought our total of humanitarian assistance in response to the Syrian conflict to more than $4.5 billion since the start of the crisis. Without our support, I believe more people would be making the dangerous voyage further north. However, even with our sizable contributions, UN appeals for humanitarian aid to address this crisis in Syria remain underfunded. And Mr. Smith, you presented a lot of those numbers, and you made the completely accurate point that we see that about 60% of the response to the appeals for inside Syria and in the surrounding countries goes unfunded, and then that's the case across the board with all of the major humanitarian emergencies right now. It's a major frustration, and it's not because the U.S. isn't doing its share. The U.S. is a major funder of all of these humanitarian operations, but even though we're doing more than we've ever done before, it's not enough relative to the need. Contributions from other donor governments, the private sector, and the public are urgently needed. The second prong of our response is diplomacy on humanitarian issues. For several years, we have engaged government officials in the region to encourage them to keep borders open, allow refugees to enter their countries, authorize the work of leading humanitarian organizations, and allow refugees to pursue normal life as normal as possible, given what they have been through. We are part of a chorus of nations that call for the respect of humanitarian principles, even inside Syria in wartime. Diplomacy on humanitarian issues means working constructively with other nations to find solutions. The issue of the refugee and migration crisis was taken up again and again in recent international fora, such as the UN General Assembly in New York in September, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees Executive Committee in Geneva in early October, and the just concluded Global Forum on Migration and Development in Istanbul. All provided opportunities for countries to come together in a common effort. I attended the first and led the U.S. delegation to the others. At all of these venues, we met on the sidelines with government officials involved in the crisis, from Sweden and Germany to Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. Diplomacy also includes pushing when needed those who can and should be doing more to do so. Many countries choose to provide assistance outside the UN system. However, we are deeply engaged on encouraging other countries to contribute to the UN appeals to Syria to help prevent duplication and ensure that precious and scarce humanitarian assistance is provided to those who need it the most. We are also encouraging countries to identify opportunities for refugees to pursue livelihoods and become more self-sufficient in ways that do not exacerbate existing unemployment issues in host countries. The third prong of our response is resettling refugees in the United States. Since 1975, the U.S. has welcomed over 3 million refugees from all over the world under the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. In fiscal year 2015, nearly 70,000 refugees of 67 different nationalities were admitted for permanent resettlement to the United States. This was the third year in a row that we reached our target of 70,000. So in fiscal year 2016, the President has determined that we should increase that number to 85,000, including at least 10,000 Syrians. And as you know, we would then strive, if successful, to reach 100,000 refugees from around the world in the following year. We need to continue and expand our efforts, and we seek to work even more closely with the European Union and its member countries, as well as those countries not part of the European Union, to help shape a comprehensive and coordinated response, and we have already started that process. In the Middle East, we are working on an initiative to get more refugee children in school in Turkey. Education for children who have been displaced, whatever their status and wherever they land, is essential for their own futures and for ours. We support the No Lost Generation campaign to educate and protect Syrian children and youth. Given the protracted nature of this crisis, we are also looking at new ways to better link our relief and development assistance. With roughly 85% of refugees now living outside of camps in cities and villages throughout the Middle East, we need to be working to help refugees become self-sufficient and support the communities that host them. So, once again, the U.S. must join with enlightened leaders in Europe to take action. And this builds on the work the Obama administration has been doing for more than 4 years to help the countries neighboring Syria and address the needs of innocent people caught up in the Syria crisis. I know that it was said that the US, Europe, and the OSCE are debating what to do. I think Europe is debating, but the US is very much doing. We're doing a lot. And we're seeking to be as helpful as possible. And that is the message that in recent weeks we've been telling European ambassadors and leaders, foreign ministers, prime ministers. And this builds on what we've been saying to the leaders of Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq in the previous several years. So I'm very happy with that to answer your questions about my testimony and related issues.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. Let me ask first, I'll throw out a few questions, then yield to my colleagues, because we all have many, many questions. In terms of the number of people potentially going to be resettled here in the United States, the UNHCR suggests that there's 10% of the Syrian refugees, or some 400,000 persons in total, are in need of resettlement. In the testimony that will be provided today, Mr. Pitterman says that UNHCR has already referred more than 45,000 Syrians for refugee resettlement, with more than 20,000 of those referrals made to the United States. Although Syrian arrivals to the U.S. have been fewer than 2,000 persons so far, he notes that they are encouraged by the intent to admit at least 10,000 in fiscal year 2016. My question is, the 2,000 that have come here, this referral of some 20,000 that have been made, at what state of process of going through their cases, where are we on that? Where are they right now physically? And with regards to the robust efforts to ensure that ISIS and other potential groups of lone wolves or wolf packs, groups of individuals who come here with malice on their mind. I know we have a very robust way of doing our screening. I've looked at it very carefully. Without objection, a Congressional Research Service, several paragraphs describing that will be made as part of the record, because I think it is robust. But it's very hard to do a background check on people about which you know very, very little, and there's very little database available anywhere to ascertain what their motives might be. And I'm wondering how we bridge that gap to ensure that we are not unwittingly welcoming to this country. I mentioned the young man that came in from Stankovic during the Kosovo crisis. I'm sure he wasn't the only one, but it happened right inside of my own district. And I remember, I was there, plane loads of people were coming down. People from the community in Mercer County and Burlington County and Ocean counties met them with a great deal of affection. And yet included among them was a man who would seek to work with the Fort Dix 5 to murder service members and their families at Fort Dix. Thankfully, that plot was thwarted, and they are now in prison, at least the 5 from the Fort Dix 5. So your thoughts on that, and then I have a couple other questions that I'll yield to Commissioner Pitts.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have brought nearly 2,000 Syrians to the United States as part of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program since 2011. And the numbers have climbed very slowly. Last year we brought, in 2015, 1,682, so almost 1,700.
And is that because of vetting issues, or?
Well, there were a couple of things. First is that when there is a crisis and people flee, you don't automatically start a refugee resettlement program. because our hope initially is that they'll be able to go home again. And quite candidly, in the first year or so of this crisis, I really thought that it would be over soon and people would be able to go back. So when that did not become the case, in 2013, UNHCR started to think about a resettlement program for Syrians who had fled to neighboring countries. That's where most of the refugees who've been referred to us are. They are living in the countries that neighbor Syria, and the top 4 countries are Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and also some are as far afield as Egypt. And we already were resettling refugees from this area because we were resettling Iraqi refugees who had fled to these countries, including Syria. So the other reason it takes a while to bring people here is our process currently takes between an average of 18 to 24 months because refugee applicants have to go through a series of steps. The most important thing I can say related to security is that no one comes here who hasn't been approved by the Department of Homeland Security. So no foreign entity or organization is deciding for us who comes to the United States, who crosses that border. And as you noted, there have been nearly 22,000 referrals made. So there are a number of people who the UNHCR has determined would potentially be good applicants for our program. So who's a good applicant for our program? Well, we tend to take people who are particularly vulnerable, people for whom going home to Syria is just not in the cards. It's just likely never to happen again. So these are people who have been, for example, torture victims who would be traumatized by returning to what once was their homes. These are people who have lost family members. Sometimes they've suffered bodily harm. Families with children that have burns or been traumatized. People who could benefit from some of the advanced medical technology that we can provide here. People who need to make a fresh start. And this is in keeping with the way we've been running the program for some years. And the amazing thing is that these people who are among the most vulnerable turn out to make perfectly fine residents in the United States and often are able to come back to support themselves. The kids do extremely well in school, and they go on to thrive. We've seen this with so many communities over the years, so I'm fairly confident that this will be the case for Syrian refugees. In terms of the security process, the refugees have help putting together their story, a case file on who they are, why they had to flee, and what their own personal histories are. And this is either an individual or a family will have a case. And then we have organizations that we fund in the Middle East to help them put that story together and then be prepared for an interview by a Department of Homeland Security interviewer. The interviewers from DHS are very well trained, so that even if there is not a lot of existing information about these individuals in U.S. files, they can see whether their stories hold up, whether they say they were at the right place at the right time. They can look at their documents. They can sort out what's been forged and what's actually authentic. They take their time on these interviews. They're very patient. I've sat in on some of the interviews. Now, I mean, maybe they had me sit in on the ones that were particularly well run, but still I came away very impressed by how our DHS colleagues walk very carefully through these stories and double check and recheck. And then we run the names against the national security and law enforcement databases that the United States maintains. And essentially we're weeding out people who are liars, who are criminals, or who are would-be terrorists. And so this is partly why the program of the 3 million people we've brought here, we have very few cases of people ending up getting into trouble or threatening trouble. That doesn't mean that we should let our guard down. I think we can only run this program taking every possible step to keep it, to keep out bad guys. I completely agree with that, and I know the entire State Department agrees with me on this. But we have to do both. We have to run a program that is as efficient as possible, that provides this humanitarian pathway to a new life for a number of the refugees, and we have to keep out the people who are up to no good.
Just a few final questions. We know what the amount of money, the unmet need that's not being provided by the international community in percentage terms. What is it in actual dollar terms? What is the unmet need for this crisis? Secondly, are you considering the designation of any P2 groups for Syrians, including Christians and other minority religions? Is that under active consideration? And on the trafficking issue, there have been a number of reports. As you know, I'm the author of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and I'm the special representative for the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly on trafficking. And we know it's a huge problem in the United States and Europe, around the world, but it's often exploited by traffickers during refugee situations or war situations, and this obviously is both. We've heard reports that in places like Bavaria, there's one refugee camp there where one worker described it as the biggest brothel in Munich, and pointed out that again, women, 80% of the camp residents are men, and the women have a very, very risky life just living there, and they are trafficked and exploited and raped. And I'm wondering, if you believe enough is being done in Europe to ensure that this kind of exploitation of women does not occur, and whether or not our tip office is actually working and collaborating with people in Europe who I know personally care deeply about the trafficking issue. And then I'll yield to Mr. Pitts.
The first question was about the funding. The second question, can you just remind me?
Was about the P2,
Oh, right.
whether or
P2
not
category.
you are actively considering designating Christians and Yazidis and other minority religions as P2 category for immigration purposes to bring these folks over.
The appeal for last year for both inside Syria and around Syria was around $8 billion, and I believe that it was funded at about, we're looking at 4 or 5. It's on a calendar year basis, so we'll see how much is brought in by the end of December. But most of the funding, I think, has been provided. On the P2, the advantage of a P2 category is that it helps UNHCR, it helps us get referrals. It facilitates that. Since we have 22,000 referrals right now, it's not a problem for us. So it's not something that would benefit us in the right at the moment. We can always take a fresh look at that. But behind your question was a concern about minorities, and certainly we definitely define the vulnerable people to include religious and ethnic minorities, and that includes Christian minorities and the Yazidis in Iraq. 40% of the refugees we've brought from Iraq have been Christians or other ethnic or religious minorities. Now with the Syrians, I don't think we'll find those large percentages because we just don't have such large percentages in the groups of refugees that have fled the country. So we'll be certainly looking at protections for those groups, but they're not as prevalent in the refugee flows as they have been for Iraqis. We have heard the stories about the exploitation taking place in Germany. We're very concerned about it. Yes, our Trafficking in Persons Office has been involved in the administration's refugee response. They've been integrated in our response through participation at senior and working levels and working groups focused on migration and refugee flows, as well as law enforcement surrounding human smuggling. We, like you, share our horror at what happens to women and girls when any big migration or refugee flow happens. We have worked hard to agree with the organizations we fund that we shouldn't wait for the evidence. We should just assume bad things are happening and put in place early steps to prevent sexual and gender-based violence. So I don't have evidence of the specific situation in Germany. We have very close working relationship right now with the Germans. I accompanied Secretary Kerry when he visited Germany and met with Syrian refugees there and talked to their foreign minister. I met with them in New York. So we can follow up and find out.
And I would note
more
that the
about
Munich
that.
example is only one of many that we have here. So I'm hoping that the tip office is collaborating not just with the state, but also with the Europeans.
I don't know. They're very involved.
Okay.
And so I'll go back and
you
find
could get
out
back.
to what extent we're tracking down some of these stories. Because we don't have evidence of the specific things that we've seen on the web taking place, but I believe bad things could be happening because they always do. And so I think we have to run down these stories with working with the German government.
Okay,
and
thank you.
I'm very happy to work with the tip office
Commissioner
on that.
Pitts?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Secretary, for coming today. And I want to emphasize that I think you should prioritize Christians and ethnic minorities for the P2 resettlement program, because I think they're most at risk. But let me go back to this question about all the young men in the refugee flow that Dr. Burgess raised, and the type of vetting processes that are utilized before admitting refugees to the United States. I heard you say you review their stories, you check the international criminal database. What other steps do you take to vet these refugees?
Well, if you want to get in deep into the details, we can have a classified briefing, which we've been giving more often now to members of Congress. And DHS are really the experts on it. But the steps include then the referral from UNHCR, so they weed out people who are not appropriate to refer to us. The preparation of their case, very importantly, the interview by DHS examiners, and then checking their names and their biometric data, their fingerprints, against U.S. law enforcement and national security databases. When there's a question, sometimes applicants are put on hold while further investigations are carried out. So nobody comes to the United States about whom there are any open questions. DHS they take their role extremely seriously.
And how long will this vetting process continue? How long does it take?
So right now the average age is 18 to 24 months. There's a sense in the administration this is too long. And part of it is we want it to be as quickly as possible for the sake of the refugees, but we also want to make sure we don't cut any corners that would relate to security. So in the coming months, we will be carrying out a review of the program. The senior White House officials have asked us to make sure we bring a fresh set of eyes to this, so we will be working probably to bring in consultants to see if there are ways to speed up the process without cutting corners.
Do you ever turn anyone down
Turn lots
for
of
lack
people
of
down.
information?
I don't know. I have to refer you to DHS on that. But no one comes about where they have any question about their safety.
To what degree do European governments share this concern about the potential for Islamic terrorists to exploit, the crisis to gain a foothold in Europe?
Well, they 100% share the concern, but they are not in a position to run the kind of program we are, as they have people walking across borders to reach their countries. So I was recently speaking and met the number 2 from the German embassy here. He said, I wish we had the luxury of taking 18 to 24 months to vet people before they cross our borders. So we are working to support UNHCR to help make sure that at the borders, as many people as possible are screened and registered. And a determination is made, are they bona fide refugees? Are they people who are perhaps economic migrants who would just come for a job and are not fleeing persecution? But I think on this next panel, this is a good question to put to some of the European witnesses, is to get at what they are able to do and what they are unable to do with the flow currently coming from the Middle East.
And where are these individuals held while you're doing this screening? Where are they?
Oh, so some of the refugees are in camps in Turkey, in southern Turkey, and in northern Jordan. Many live outside of camps, as I mentioned. So they're living in apartments or in homes, sometimes with relatives. They're living on their own. They come to UNHCR offices to apply for the program, or they're referred by UNHCR or NGO staff who know about their situations and think they might make good candidates for resettlement in a third country.
Now, Secretary Kerry announced that the refugee ceiling in 2017 will be 100,000. What nationalities do you anticipate admitting in significant number next year?
Well, in the past, it's been the three top nationalities were Burmese, Bhutanese, and Iraqis. And that's changing because we've brought so many Bhutanese from Nepal that the numbers are now going down. We will still see significant numbers of Burmese, Iraqis, and now we'll be adding Somalis are climbing in terms of their percentage coming. So that will continue to be the case. I think what you'll see is about half of the people coming will be from Africa, and half will be roughly 40 to 50% from the Middle East.
And what are the most common root causes for displacement in Africa?
Well, in terms of becoming a refugee, you have to prove that you're fleeing, you have a well-founded fear of persecution for one of 5 reasons, which are race, nationality, religion, political belief, or membership in a particular social group. Displacement in Africa, of course, happens for more than that reason. Some people are fleeing famine, some people are fleeing at one point Ebola. But right now we see big displacement because of poor governance and fighting in South Sudan. People have been living outside of Somalia in nearby countries for years now as that government, first for the violence and now as that government tries to get its feet under it. We're seeing more and more people coming from West Africa who are fleeing Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, and they're going to several countries nearby. So we also have unrest in Burundi causing people to flee. So often it's governance, poor governance, fighting.
You haven't mentioned Syria yet. How many Syrian refugee cases has UNHCR referred to the U.S. program?
It's about 22,000 now.
22,000. And at what stage are these cases in the U.S. resettlement consideration process?
They're at all stages of the process. Because it takes a couple of years, we are only just now seeing large numbers arrive. And so that's why we're anticipating that this year we can climb from nearly 1,700 last year to more like 10,000 this year.
Okay, and where will the United States process Syrian refugee cases this year?
So the top places will be in Jordan and Amman, Jordan, and in Turkey. And we also have some other facilities in the region. We would like to start bringing people out of Lebanon, but we're delayed doing that at the moment. So let's see. So Jordan is number 1. Turkey, Egypt are the other countries where we can bring sizable numbers right now.
All right. Finally, OSCE. Could you elaborate on the role that OSCE could have in monitoring the treatment of refugees as they transit from OSCE countries?
I'd like to answer that question. Before I do, I would just say, because I didn't know this until I saw it on a piece of paper in front of me, that of 18,000 referrals we have right now, 4,000 have been interviewed by DHS already, and 14,000 are awaiting their interview or getting ready for their interview. On the OSCE, we welcome any efforts by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and any of its institutions or field missions to coordinate with UNHCR and other international organizations to provide assistance to countries dealing with refugee and migration crises in Europe. The OSCE Secretariat and institutions such as the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights and the High Commission for National Minorities have experience helping countries respond to crises. The OSCE has a history of working with UNHCR. Just last year, the OSCE and UNHCR issued a detailed protection checklist outlining the types of actions the two organizations could take in response to various types of crises. OSCE is hosting a conference in Amman, Jordan, with its Mediterranean country partners, so that's Algeria, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, today and tomorrow, to discuss common challenges to European security, including the irregular migration, refugee protection, and trafficking in persons concerns. And of course, we support efforts by OSCE in this regard. And U.S. Ambassador to the OSCE, Daniel Baer, is the leading U.S. leading the U.S. delegation to the conference. We also believe that OSCE will be putting together an appeal for some funding from us, and so that our Europe Bureau colleagues would be taking a look at funding that.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Commissioner Shaheen?
Thank you very much. I just returned with 3 other senators from a trip to Europe. We visited Greece, the island of Lesbos, where many refugees are coming in, and then we visited Germany. And one of the things that we heard from all the officials that we talked with, we met with some officials from Frontex, from UNHCR, people at reception centers who were dealing with the crisis, was that they hoped that the United States would be able to do more to help. So you've talked a little bit about some of the challenges that we have in terms of vetting refugees, but can you elaborate a little bit on the obstacles to bringing refugees in, and then also to the challenge of providing humanitarian assistance? I know that the United States is one of the top countries in terms of providing humanitarian assistance, but my understanding is that the UN appeal is only 41% funded. And are there other ways in which we can urge countries to be more supportive of those humanitarian efforts?
Thank you for your trip to the region, which I heard about when I was in Turkey. So, and I'll be very interested to hear how.
We learned a lot.
I know I answered the questions, but I'm still curious to hear how your trip went. The challenges of bringing refugees in is that we want to be certain we're bringing the right people.
Sure.
And so getting this balance right between determining who the most vulnerable are, who are the people who would benefit the most from restarting their lives in the United States, and also ensuring that our security measures are good so that we keep out anyone with bad intentions. That's the tricky thing to do. And it involves several U.S. government agencies. It involves a couple of major international organizations, and it involves many not-for-profit, non-governmental organizations on both sides of the ocean. So it's there are many hands that help the refugees along the way, and that takes time. The good part is that it's a very successful program that works year in and year out. We've brought 70,000 refugees to the United States from all around the world over the past 3 years. I meet refugees all around the United States, and I ask them, is this a good program? Should we continue to run it? And they feel it is a life-saving program that has given their whole family a chance for a new future. And personally, I feel that it strengthens the United States to have such a diverse population and be bringing in people from all around the world. It adds to our culture, to our fabric. So I am convinced that the program should continue and should be strong, and will likely be strong. But it does take a lot of steps, and it's also a public-private partnership. The life of a refugee coming to the United States is very challenging. It's not a luxurious program. Within 1 to 3 months of arriving, able-bodied refugees have to get a job. And many refugees, if they don't speak English well, they have to start over at the bottom of the economic ladder. But they do it, and they're very employers tell us that they're very, very good, highly motivated workers. Children get enrolled in school. The younger the kids are, the more quickly they adapt. Older kids takes a little longer, but generally, program's great.
Sure, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I actually support our program. The question that I'm really asking is, are there ways for us to be more efficient, do the same kind of vetting, but to do it in a way that is more efficient, that better coordinates all the various players who are part of the effort, so that we can more effectively respond when we see this kind of a crisis?
The process that has had a lot of scrutiny from the National Security Council and the White House over the course of this administration. And so a lot of steps have been taken, a lot of sort of the easier steps have been taken to tighten up the program. But my sense is that few of us are satisfied that it still takes an average of 18 to 24 months to bring people. So we've been asked to take a fresh look, and in the coming months to have consultants come in and review the whole process and see if we can shorten the time span that it takes to bring refugees without cutting corners on security.
Okay, thank you. And can you respond on the 41% of funding that's actually been produced for
Yeah.
humanitarian efforts? And
So
and if you could also speak to some of our allies in the Middle East, in Arab countries, and their commitment to help with the refugees.
So even though we're providing sort of what I see as the foundation of the humanitarian assistance that goes to some of the most effective operational organizations overseas, and we get very solid support, bipartisan support from the House and the Senate, it's not enough funding. And so we need other countries to provide assistance and other countries to do more. So first, the traditional donors may have been suffering from fatigue, because I felt in the last year or two that their contributions, while increasing, were not keeping pace with the needed increases. So certainly Europe now is very focused on needing to provide more assistance to help the refugees who are in the Middle East and are displaced inside Syria, and also refugees in the surrounding neighboring countries. Then for a couple of years now, we have been trying to encourage Gulf states to become routine, regular donors to and through United Nations appeals. And I would say we've had mixed success on this. We have seen some very large, generous contributions, but they tend to be one-time only checks written. They're not always through the UN. They're nothing you can count on will happen again the following year. We're very appreciative that Kuwait held 3 annual pledging conferences on the Syria crisis, and I attended all of them. That did help to put real money on the table, and the U.S. and Kuwait were the top donors in response to those pledging conferences. But it's not enough, and what we'd like to see is some more Gulf states become regular annual donors in a dependable way with the United Nations. Then we look at the U.S. and the U.K. as and France as part of the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. But Russia and China are also members, and we don't see them being engaged on humanitarian activities, supporting humanitarian activities to the way that the other members are. So we would like to see more countries involved and joining the table of traditional donors, expand that. Then we also are very interested in getting more private sector contributions from philanthropies, foundations, but also businesses and from the public. So for me, it's been very gratifying that in recent weeks we have seen that happen. And we've gone from wondering how to make that happen to seeing it really happen. And so now the question is, how can we make this a sustaining interest? What we've seen is that Americans can be very generous, but tend to prefer to give after natural disasters, like the earthquake in Haiti. I believe half of all households were reported, American households were reported to give. So I think there's been a sense that the situation in the Middle East is messy, and there's a lot of bad guys running around, and we didn't want to do anything to support them. But I know that there are a lot of families, innocent families, who are being victimized by terrorists, who deserve help. And I think when Americans see the faces of these families, they realize, oh, these are people we have to help. We must help. We feel compelled to help. So I'd like to build on some of the generosity that we've seen in recent weeks. And of course, this is not the responsibility of the U.S. government to do that, but to encourage it, certainly, and see more giving from more private sector and more members of the public.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have other questions, but I'll reserve them for the next panel.
Thank you. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Secretary, for being here today. You said in your opening statement that one of the drivers of the flood of refugees to Europe was the perception that Europe was open. Can you expand upon that a little bit? What gave people that impression?
I think that, the fact that early waves were getting all the way to Germany and were being received in Germany then may have, through social media and through just plain old media, suggested to people this was the time to go and that they would be able to make it all that way. It's probably a question best answered by Europeans, but that's without being an expert in all the specific details on this. I think that was part of what was happening.
Well, let me just, you mentioned social media, and that was actually what I was going to get to. Was social media one of the drivers that led to this?
I've been told that you can get a lot of information about how to make the voyage and the journey off of the web and off of one's phone.
I would expect that's probably true. As far as the 1,700 individuals that were approved in this last fiscal year 2016,
they arrived.
They arrived, and those all went through the DHS vetting process. And of that 1,700, how many were not approved, and what then happened to them?
No, the 1,700 is the number that were approved. So I don't have the numbers that were disapproved, were rejected to come, and we can try to get that for you.
And then the numbers are going to go up, so there's going to be a scaling issue with Department of Homeland Security being able to keep up with the numbers that you will be asking them to vet. Is that correct?
That is very correct.
And what are the discussions that you've had with the Secretary of Homeland Security, or that Secretary Kerry has had with the Secretary of Homeland Security about what you're doing in your agency and what they might expect in their agency?
We have had a series for a couple of years now of interagency meetings that the NSC has pulled together, and deputies committee meetings, and even a principals committee meeting or two. So at different levels of the executive branch that bring together the State Department, Health and Human Services, because they provide assistance to the
Yeah, I have
states
some
to help
questions I want to ask you about that. but
after
yeah, go on.
refugees get here, and then DHS and also some of the other law enforcement and national security agencies to make sure all of these pieces are working together. And there is a lot of pressure now for DHS to get more interviewers hired, trained, and out to the field so that they can support bringing higher numbers of refugees out to the field all around the world and not just in the Middle East.
Certainly in Texas last summer, July of 2014, we saw some of the deficiencies of the Office of Refugee Relocation through the Department of Health and Human Services, who were responsible for processing and handling the unaccompanied minors as they came through. And it seemed like they were pretty much at or beyond their limit. Are you talking with your counterparts in the Department of Health and Human Services about additional stresses that may be placed on their system because of the numbers that you're proposing to bring in?
So all of the agencies, all three of the agencies that play the biggest roles in this, have to make trade-offs in terms of their budgets about what they're going to fund related to this program. So for the State Department, the question is, how much of our funding goes to overseas assistance to help people who are either displaced in their own countries or refugees nearby? And how much do we then spend to bring refugees to the United States? And right now we're spending about $400 million of our budget for them. So most of our funding goes overseas, but it is sizable. Then for DHS, the question was, do they use their staff to help asylum applicants in the United States, or do they send them overseas to do these interviews? And they were sort of, the two missions were competing against each other to a certain extent over the past year. So hiring more interviewers will help address that issue. And then the Office of Refugee Resettlement in HHS has a couple of different responsibilities. And as you rightly point out, one of it is to help unaccompanied minor children arriving in the United States, such as happened last summer and has happened since, but it's peaked last summer at the U.S.-Mexico border. And so they are responsible for these unaccompanied minor children, but they also are responsible for providing assistance through the states to help refugees beyond that initial 3 months reception and placement piece that the State Department funds for special programs, either to help people who need a little longer time getting a job or with English language classes or other special programs. So all of these things cost money. And right now, the administration is working with OMB to determine if we need to be requesting increases in our budgets to handle these things. But I think your question is right on target in terms of where we need to be doing more work and providing answers to you.
Well, and of course, it's not your agency, but ORR specifically, in my opinion, needs to work more closely with the states that are going to be affected by the people who are then resettled in those communities. There are stresses that are placed upon our local governments, our school districts, because of the numbers of people who are resettled in those communities.
I think that is my responsibility, though, as
I had this
someone
discussion
with
with Secretary Newland when she came before OSCE a year and a half ago. Yes, I think it would be good if state would talk to perhaps senators or even individual members of Congress about people who are being resettled within their district boundaries or their state boundaries. I think that would be extremely helpful. My personal experience has been that does not happen. I've not been as affected as some other members of Congress and other senators, but it certainly does occur, and something you hear about from your local folks all the time.
It's a requirement of the program, and we have made it more specific what has to be done, that the 9 groups that resettle refugees in the United States with us, they're all not-for-profit, 6 are faith-based, 3 are not, that they consult with community leaders about their plans for resettling refugees so that the local sheriff and the mayor and the school superintendent are not surprised when people are showing up in their villages, in their homes, in their cities. I recently, at the end of August, traveled to Spartanburg, South Carolina, because Congressman Trey Gowdy had questions about whether sufficient consultation was done. And so I went down and traveled with his staff and met with a lot of local leaders there. So I see this as part of our job to make sure that this happens. I'm sorry, I can't get to Better Know a District in all 435, but we are making.
But you know where the people are going. I mean, it's not a surprise to you.
Texas is number one.
It's
7,479 refugees went to Texas last year. I'm sure a lot of refugees would like to live in Texas. But so what we're doing is we're making sure that it's a requirement of our partners that do the actual reception and placement that they check with local leaders, and they do it 4 times a year.
Perhaps if you could provide me some of that data that's been generated by that requirement and divulging that information just before, and I'm going to conclude. But I mean, Chairman Smith made the observation about the number of refugees that were young males. Chairman Pitts asked you a similar sort of question. So really give us some comfort here. When you look at those pictures, and they do seem to be predominantly military-age males with very few women and children scattered throughout, and Chairman Smith has some statistics. I think Chairman Pitts had some statistics. Why is that? Are these young men fleeing conscription? Is there perhaps a darker purpose afoot? Why does it appear that way?
I think that for young men coming directly out of Syria, part of it is they are trying to avoid serving in the Assad regime's military. And they do not want to be part of his war effort. And they are people who prefer to live in peace and just want a normal life. And then for those fleeing from nearby countries, or not fleeing, but leaving, choosing to leave nearby countries, it's partly because they don't have jobs that are legal jobs. Many are working, but they're working in an underground economy where they can be exploited and abused and underpaid. And that's not appreciated by their neighbors. And so they're looking for a place they can go where they can finish their education, some of them, or they can get their kids in school, because a lot of children are out of school from the Syrian refugee community. And they can, practice acquire skills or practice the professions that they've acquired. And so they're moving to Europe because they think they will have a better life in the places that they've been.
I guess what I don't understand is why are they leaving and not giving preference to their wives, their girlfriends, their mothers,
Yeah.
people who might be more readily exploitable by
Say
ISIS?
that. Well, I think that they are leaving their families in places that they believe are safe. Those members of the family inside Syria would not be recruited into the military. I'm amazed that nearly 7 million displaced Syrians have stayed inside Syria, though. Part of that is because of programs to try to get as much aid into the country to benefit innocent people as possible. But for the people who are leaving from Turkey and from Jordan, they feel their families are safe. They have achieved safety, but they're not able to afford to live there. I talked to a woman in Germany who'd left 2 daughters behind and gone, on this dangerous trip by boat from Turkey to Greece with a 5-year-old. And I said, wasn't it dangerous? And she said, yeah. But she could not afford to live in Turkey because the rents were so high. And so she felt that the best thing for the family was to go on ahead, reach Germany, establish a toehold there, and then later send for other family members, or send money back to the older daughters. I just think these are people who feel very desperate and are taking risks with their families, the kind of risks that we don't have to do in a normal day in the United States. But it's not because they're a threat to the Europeans. It's because they really are looking for opportunity and trying to have a sense that there's hope. They can have hope for a better life.
I pray that you're right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've been very indulgent. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Burgess. Dr. Bozeman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. We appreciate your hard work. There's some confusion about what the Gulf states are doing. Can you elaborate on that? What they're doing in regard to the numbers that they're accepting as far as Syrian refugees?
They're not accepting Syrian refugees. They are giving
is
work
Saudi Arabia-
visas to Syrians to come work in their countries, which is helping some families get out of harm's way and to support themselves.
So that's where the claim of Saudi Arabia that they've got a couple
They have a lot of
million?
Syrians living there right now who are working in jobs and have work visas. So that's a good thing for those families. If they lose their jobs, will they have to leave the country? That would be a question I would want to ask. But what we would like to see is more countries be open to resettling refugees the way we do. And right now, the U.S. is the world leader in doing that. And traditionally, Canada, Australia, UK, New Zealand are the other countries that take numbers of refugees, sizable numbers of refugees. So part of our mission is to encourage countries to do more. And what we're seeing is some of their own publics are looking for that now, are asking for that. And what Europe is doing is looking into having that as part of a package of things they'll do to deal with the stream of people headed their way.
What are the top 3 or 4 things that the Europeans, what are their top 3 or 4 problems that they've got as they manage the crisis?
The biggest issues is that, Europe has a common border now, the EU does, but it's a very porous border in terms of Italy and Greece and the coastline. Different countries have different abilities to manage and secure their borders and to vet people coming across. And then there are different policies, not only from country to country, but also sometimes within a country, for vetting refugees and determining who can stay. So I believe you're going to be hearing from, in the second panel, some European leaders, so it's probably best for them to describe that, but that's my thumbnail impression of what the problem is right now.
You mentioned the borders. Are there any other policies that you feel like are driving the ability to get into Europe? Does that make sense? Any of the European policies?
Well, I think
perhaps are
Europeans would
driving
say, you know, it's not just a question of entering Greece, it's also leaving Turkey, and is there a coast guard there? And that's one of the things that's being discussed as part of the EU negotiations with Turkey about what else can be done. So there's
kind of in line with Congressman Burgess, among those involved in the mixed migration crisis in Europe, what percentage, and again, and also this would pertain to us, but what percentage are seeking asylum are estimated to be migrants and the countries involved there, as opposed to what percentage are estimated to be refugees, and from which countries?
I probably have this in this enormous book in front of me.
The scenario that you described earlier, you know, with people in regard to the young man coming, you mentioned jobs, you know, things like that. So that would be more migrant than refugee.
Does Senator Boozman have this?
Would be migrant versus.
So if you look at these pie charts down here, the dark pink area are people who are considered refugees, recognized as refugees based on those coming, and then the lighter pink is those who have been determined to not qualify as refugees. So it starts to give you a picture of that on the Western Balkans route, certainly most are fleeing war, are Syrians, Iraqis, Afghans, or violence. Eritreans are fleeing a repressive government and forced conscription into their national service. For other parts of Africa, it's less refugees and more economic migrants. But for Nigerians, for example, some would be refugees if they're fleeing Boko Haram in northern Nigeria.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Richard.
Dr. Bozeman. Commissioner Holtgren.
Thank you so much for your work. Thank you for being here today. And many of my questions and concerns have been discussed already. But just quickly, as far as I haven't heard you talk much about reaction of local populations in Europe and concern of how they're responding to this significant impact on their countries, as far as political parties or some upheaval reacting to the changes that are coming to their countries because of this, and certain regions maybe having significant numbers of refugees there. What, from the State Department, what are you sensing there? What concern do you have, and what can we do maybe to help ease some of that fear or uncertainty or the process that they're working through there with this great influx of refugees?
Well, I think you see European publics responding in a number of ways. Some are quite welcoming to the refugees, and some of them are not welcoming at all. And there is, you know, a lot of attention to the rise of parties that are xenophobic or anti-immigrant, anti-refugee in various countries of Western Europe. So I'll leave it to European witnesses to discuss that. I think what the U.S. can do, that we are doing, is invite people to come here and see how our refugee resettlement program works. Because even though it's, like I say, not a luxurious program, it's a public-private partnership that relies on a lot of contributions at the local level in terms of used furniture, used clothing, winter coats for people coming from Somalia to Minnesota. It is one that works. And so we're trying to sort of model how you can bring people from other cultures, other countries, other religions to your country and all get along just fine. And so that's I think the most important thing we can do.
We've seen some, I represent Illinois, west of Chicago, and World Relief and some other agencies have been fabulous of helping that transition. But I do know, thank you again for your work. I'm going to yield back. I know we've got another panel that want to hear from as well. So
I
thank you
just,
very much. Sir.
Thank you.
Ask a couple of follow-up questions, and then we'll conclude, although we have another member who just joined us. Let me just ask, how was the 10,000 number arrived at? Why not 15,000? Why not 20? Why not 5? Was it scientifically arrived at? Is it a sense that this is our number? Who calculated that number to get to 10,000? Secondly, EU Ambassador David O'Sullivan will be testifying shortly before this commission, and lays out a number of things that the Europeans have done and continue to do, dozens of initiatives, including funding, like us, to UNHCR and other initiatives. But he also points out that we've launched rescuing operations Poseidon and Triton, and tripled our presence at sea. Over 122,000 lives have been saved. Now, my question is, the Sixth Fleet obviously is deployed. There's 26 countries of Europe that are part of that effort. Triton, for example. How are we collaborating? Is the Sixth Fleet collaborating with those rescue efforts at sea? What is our role there? And finally, Mr. Pitterman makes a very good point talking about long-term trends. Two of them he notes. Why now? Why are people up, and leaving and coming to Europe and potentially to the United States? He said they've lost hope in a political solution to the war. And then after so many years in exile, resources have run out, living conditions have so deteriorated. Two long-term trends, but he said the trigger is the humanitarian funding shortfall. Again, the WFP, the World Food Program's cut of 30% that have just driven people to the point where they don't have food, so they uproot and leave even their meager existence there. Is that true? Do you agree with that assessment?
On the second question first, I do think that the cuts in the World Food Program rations and the food voucher values did send a signal, not from the United States, but it was interpreted as a signal from the world that the international community was losing interest and things were going to get harder for refugees in these countries. So that, I think many of us feel if we could go back in time that there would have been much more investment in that. And like I say, the U.S. is the leading donor to the World Food Program. So this is not the fault of the United States, but it is a fault of the collective international community that was allowed to happen. Was it the one single trigger? I don't know. I mean, we've talked about push and pull factors, but I think it was a factor, definitely. Last December, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees had a very interesting dialogue. He organizes sort of a more informal meeting every December on a protection concern, and this past year, it was protection at sea. So I asked the U.S. Coast Guard to come along with us to that discussion in Geneva, which doesn't usually happen, that we have a joint our Bureau with Coast Guard discussion. But I thought that they are so thoughtful in how they do things in the Caribbean that it would be useful for them to be part of the discussion. And also there were members of the Italian Navy who also came. So it was a really unusual meeting where we had non-governmental organizations, governments, and then Coast Guards and Navies present. I know that U.S. Navy, U.S. Coast Guard make a priority of saving lives, no matter who is approaching their ship and who's in distress nearby. So I'm sure, without knowing the details, that the Sixth Fleet plays a life-saving role in the Mediterranean. But I'm not the expert on how they're working with the European efforts, and so I'll leave that to the next panel.
Again, the 10,000 number, how was that arrived at? And if you could get back to us on the Sixth Fleet, I think it would be
Okay.
very helpful to the Commission to know. And I know that they would never pass someone who's in distress,
Sure.
but are they working with these two European Union efforts?
On the 10,000 number, we were already planning to increase our numbers to between 5 to 8,000, and the president decided we'd bring a few more than that. So that's how the 10,000 number was arrived at.
Joined by Commissioner Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank you for holding this hearing. It's such an important issue, and so important that America do what America has done so many times in the past to offer our shores as a place of refuge to people who have been endangered by political conditions in their countries. And I think back personally as a Jewish American to the situation with Jews who were not accepted in this country on ships during the 40s and maybe the 30s, and I'm sure they met a disastrous outcome because we didn't open our shores at the time. And we should learn from those mistakes, and I believe we will. I hope that the President will allow for a parole relationship and bring in the refugees who have been cleared, who are not in any way, because of the best that we can ascertain, a threat to our country, but are in need of refugee status. And I think it's part of our country's, what makes our country great and what makes our country the greatest country on the face of the earth. And as the Pope reminded us, we were all immigrants. The only people that weren't immigrants were victims of one of the greatest slaughters ever, and the American natives, the American Indians. So as immigrants, we need to remember, as the Pope told us, the golden rule, and do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. And as I think about possibly my ancestors who would have been on those ships, the St. Louis, that were not accepted, I think we need to be the great country we are and accept as many folks as we can and save them from the ravages of ISIS and the terrors of war that exist in Syria. The food program was cut back, as I understand it. Was there any issue with funding for the food program?
Yes, the Food for Peace office at the U.S. Agency for International Development leads the U.S. government in relations with the World Food Program. The World Food Program is headed by an American, Earthring cousin from Chicago, who and their headquarters is in Rome. We have a very close relationship with them also, because sometimes our budget is used when there are food pipeline breaks in terms of the pipeline of food reaching refugees in hard-to-reach places, and primarily in Africa. So the U.S. is the top donor to the World Food Program year in and year out. It's something I think we're very proud of as Americans, that we don't want people going hungry. But other countries were not keeping pace with their contributions as we were. And it wasn't enough for the people running the program in the region to continue to provide benefits to as many refugees as they would have liked. So what they did was they targeted the most vulnerable, neediest refugees, and they cut back then both in the number of people they were reaching and the value of the food vouchers they were giving them. And it may, as we were just discussing, it may have been a trigger for people deciding to leave the region and try to make it to Europe.
In which countries was the American, our contribution remained constant, is that correct? Or was there a cut in funding on our side?
It's not a cut in funding on our side, because we're both humanitarian assistance that USAID gets through the Food for Peace program and the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, and our budget have been well funded by Congress in the last several years. And so one of my messages today are thank you very much, because we are the world leader in providing this humanitarian assistance. And right now we have about $3 billion, and AID has about $3 billion of food and disaster assistance that together makes a $6 billion contribution, which is sizable, to needs around the world. The problem is the needs are, the list of crises is growing. The old crises continue even as new ones erupt. We're praying that there will be peace in South Sudan, potentially peace in Yemen. Places where there have been efforts to resolve conflicts will happen, so that we can then, use our precious resources for these very, very challenging situations.
Were there other countries that cut back on their financial contribution?
I don't have the details for you, but my sense was they either cut back or they weren't keeping pace with the growth, which we were able to do thanks to Congress.
And which countries were those?
Well, we were talking before, there is a group of traditional donors, which are Western Europe, US, Canada, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. And so collectively, we were unable to keep pace, but I think the US did its share. Then there's the Gulf states where they are sometimes, some of them are charitable, particularly charitable and write big checks, and sometimes not. And it's very, they tend to give in very one-off situations. And so we would like to see more uniform giving, routine giving from the Gulf states. And then there are other countries that just do not make a habit of providing assistance through humanitarian assistance. They prefer to do other ways of engaging with the world. I mentioned China and Russia before as to, countries that are on the permanent 5 of the UN Security Council, but they're not really part of the traditional donors.
Is what you tell me, and it sounds like, and it's probably an obvious answer, but the democracies seem to do pretty good in caring for other people, and the totalitarian regimes and dictatorships don't. So it kind of flows from what they give to their own, they don't give to others either.
Well, it's called, Western donors, but now we see Japan, Korea. Korea has become a regular donor and didn't used to be. I mean, at one point it was an aid recipient. So I don't think it has to be a Western enterprise. I think that it can be.
But they're all
much more
democracies that you say are keeping up with it. The Western Europe, Korea, Japan, United States, Canada, it's the democracies. So that's a
Well,
good
and
thing.
part of it may be that publics expect this from their governments in democracies and make it known that they want to see this happen. The Gulf states can be very charitable. I mean, giving during Ramadan especially goes up. It's a traditional practice in Muslim societies, but it's just not something that can be that right now is part of an annual contribution that can be relied on by UN leaders.
Maybe Ramadan should be every day of the week, like Christmas.
And Christmas.
Yeah, well, exactly. Who are the people that are? I know Jimmy McGovern's big on feeding the world. Were Jimmy's the leader? Is Chris a leader? Who are the leaders in Congress on this?
How many times do you think I've testified before you, Mr. Smith? I mean, he's very used
Both
to.
hands and
He's
both
very
feet.
interested in our issues. So yeah, he's definitely a leader. I met Senator Boozman before, and we had a talk about the Syrian refugees. It was after you went, I think, to Turkey or something. There's been a lot of visitors to Turkey and Jordan, which I find very good in terms of helping me explain to others what is going on. And then Senator Shaheen just came back from Greece. I haven't been to Greece lately. I would have liked to have gone to Greece. I get other countries to go to. But it really helps us when you all travel and go out and meet refugees. But one doesn't have to go overseas to meet refugees, of course. There are a lot of refugee families in the United States who can talk about, they're probably in this room behind me, who can talk about the experiences they've had and what their relatives are going through.
Thank you for your good work, and thank you, Chairman Smith, for your good work as well.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Cohen. I'd like to thank you and Madam Secretary for your extensive answers and for the work of PRM on behalf of those who are suffering, these refugees and displaced persons, and look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you. Well, I appreciate that very much. We all do. I'd like to now welcome our second panel. The Commission is very pleased to welcome Shelley Pitterman, the UNHCR Regional Representative for the USA and the Caribbean. During his 30-year career with UNHCR, Mr. Pitterman has served on the ground in Sudan, Guinea, Burundi, as well as the UNHCR headquarters in Geneva, and of course here in Washington. He also was seconded to the UN Work Relief, UNRWA, the UN Works Relief and Works Agency, where he worked with the Palestinian refugees in Jordan. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Pitterman. We'll then hear from Ambassador of the Republic of Serbia to the United States, Drž Matkovic. Ambassador Matkovic has served as Serbia's ambassador to the U.S. since February of this year. Before his time in Washington, he was the foreign policy advisor to the Serbian Prime Minister Vučić. He currently holds his country the OSCE chairmanship for the 2015. So thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here. We'll then hear from Sean Callahan, Chief Operating Officer of Catholic Relief Services. the official international humanitarian agency of the Catholic community here in the United States. Mr. Callahan is responsible for overseas operations, U.S. operations, and human resources, and for ensuring CRS's fidelity to the mission to preserve and uphold human life. And they have done a magnificent job. I mentioned being in Stenkovic, Macedonia, at a refugee camp, and I've lost track of the number of times I've been in a refugee camp and I saw the CRS initials on the baseball cap. Thank you so much for the work that you have done and CRS has done. And lastly, EU Ambassador to the United States, David O'Sullivan, who is currently the Senior Representative of the European Union in Washington. Prior to his current appointment, Ambassador O'Sullivan served as Chief Operating Officer of the European External Action Service, the EU's diplomatic service, where he assisted the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy in ensuring the consistency and coordination of the EU's external policies, strategies, instruments, missions, and the 140 EU diplomatic delegations throughout the world. We deeply appreciate the appearance of Ambassador O'Sullivan here today as a gesture of friendship and cooperation with the European Union. We recognize that the normal congressional oversight authority over witnesses does not hold for diplomatic witnesses, and we recognize his official relationship to the United States government. Ambassador O'Sullivan, thank you again for taking the time out, and all of you for being here to provide your expertise, guidance, and wisdom to the Commission. I'd like to begin now with Mr. Peterman.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman. It's for me a great honor and privilege to be here. It's my first time since I took up my assignment as the regional representative of UNHCR in 2013. So much has already been said by you, Mr. Chairman, and others, by Ann Richard as well, in relation to the current situation, the numbers, the reasons for flight, and so on. So I will not repeat those remarks and therefore try to keep it short. But I did want to nevertheless mention a few numbers that have not been stated and a couple of other themes that might also provoke some conversation. It's important, I think, to remember that now we are at more than 60 million refugees, forcibly displaced people around the world. That translates to 42,500 people every day. There have been more than 15 new conflicts in the last 5 years, and none of the old conflicts have been resolved. So we're also witnessing the low point in the numbers of people who are voluntarily returning to their countries, and so we are facing not only protracted situations and new emergencies, we are facing protracted emergencies. And the first and foremost on our agenda as the UN Refugee Agency is the mega crisis in Syria and Iraq, which for the first time in years has now hit Europe. As the High Commissioner said, the poor have come to the home of the rich, and the world has taken notice. More than 643,000 people have arrived through Greece and Italy. The trends of the flow have changed over recent months from the central Mediterranean to the eastern Mediterranean, and the movement that is now very much on our television screens and newspapers. Yesterday's images, I don't know if you saw them on the BBC at the border between Serbia and Croatia. I was shocked myself, and I believe it's just unbelievable that that's happening these days. People in wheelchairs stuck in the mud in freezing rain temperatures. That having been said, it's clear that this is overwhelmingly a refugee movement. These are people who were forcibly displaced from their homes. 90% of the people who are arriving are coming from the 10 top refugee-producing countries in the world, Syria first and foremost, as well as Afghanistan, Eritrea, Iraq, Nigeria, Somalia, and Sudan. The conflict in Syria has entered its 5th year. There's no end in sight. As we spoke earlier, you made reference, Mr. Chairman, to the lack of hope, to the desperation, to the increasing impoverishment of refugees, leading them now to take the hard decision, even in the cold, as we're seeing these days, to cross to Europe. Like all other refugee movements, stemming the tide is not an effective policy objective. Building barriers, as we've seen in some European states, or pushing back refugees, as we've seen in other European states, doesn't, and elsewhere around the world, simply doesn't work. To quote the High Commissioner for Refugees, those who believe that the easy solution is to close doors should forget about it. When a door is closed, people will open a window. If the window is closed, people will dig a tunnel. If there's a basic need for survival, a basic need for protection, people will move. Whatever obstacles are put in their way, those obstacles will only make their journeys more dramatic. And that we're seeing in Europe, we're seeing it as well in Central America, that there's then a temptation, a need for refugees to resort to smugglers and traffickers in order to find security and safety. What matters is the management of the flow, not stemming the tide. And in Europe, there's evidence that the flow has not been very well managed up until now. And there is a pressure by force of circumstance, but also leadership in Europe and in the European Union to resolve that and to address the problem in a more unified and coherent way. UNHCR is active itself in trying to find a comprehensive solution. First, by focusing on saving the lives of refugees and addressing humanitarian protection needs, especially at the points of transit, first arrival, and destination. We're working hard to as well strengthen protection systems through capacity building for asylum procedures in Europe, but also in the Eastern Horn of Africa, from where some of the refugees are coming, as well as from North Africa, and reinforcing the availability of protection and solutions in the regions where they first find security and safety. So we have been working to provide emergency life-saving assistance, strengthening first-line reception capacity, providing information, simple matters such as even interpretation, protection monitoring, advocacy, working with the civil society, and focusing as well on unaccompanied and separated children, of whom there are several thousand who have been registered to date. We think that the United States has a key leadership role to play, always has, and hopefully always will, not only in terms of humanitarian funding, a subject which has been already discussed, where we have the gaps and where we count on Congress and the State Department to provide support, but also in terms of humanitarian diplomacy and resettlement. Most refugees want to return home, but because of the conflict, wars, and persecution, many refugees are unable to repatriate. They live in perilous circumstances, and so we identify those who require a resettlement solution for their own protection, as well as part of a strategic approach to burden sharing. According to the UNHCR current assessments, about 10% of Syrian refugees, about 400,000 people, will need resettlement over the coming years. We focused our resettlement efforts on identifying and referring the most vulnerable refugees in Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and Iraq, as well as in Egypt. So far, we've referred more than 45,000 Syrians for refugee resettlement globally, with 20,000 made to the United States. And as you mentioned earlier, Mr. Chairman, we're quite encouraged that there is now an acceleration of the process of processing of refugees for resettlement to the United States. One point that hasn't been mentioned before that I'd like to highlight now is that UNHCR has been encouraging states to offer other legal avenues for access to safety and security. Resettlement is one, but we see as well family reunification, other types of humanitarian visas as an opportunity for Syrians and other refugees for that matter to gain access rather than having to risk dangerous journeys in order to arrive in a secure place. And this might also address the willingness of the diaspora community to receive their family members from places to receive their family members from countries of asylum now. But still, resettlement will remain a solution for only a small percentage of the Syrian refugees, and that's why there has to be a comprehensive international response to the Syrian humanitarian crisis, one that also includes robust humanitarian assistance to Syrian refugees and to the governments and communities where they're hosted in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. This will have to be accomplished with development actors and with development budgets as well. As the High Commissioner said in his closing remarks to the Executive Committee earlier this month, there is no way that global humanitarian budgets will be able to face the enormous challenges related to the dramatic growth of the humanitarian problem in the world. UNHCR therefore appeals to the United States to continue to exercise leadership in helping refugees in the host communities and asylum countries to recover and grow after the trauma of flight. Because the US government and the American people know better than most just how richly refugees and migrants can indeed contribute to the political, economic, and cultural fabric of a nation. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Pitterman. Ambassador Markovich.
Chairman Smith, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed members of the Helsinki Commission. Thank you for the invitation to testify before you today. Thank you for the invitation to testify before you today on the issue of the migrant crisis in Europe. I would like also to thank you for organizing this important hearing.
Mr. Ambassador, could you just bring the mic a little closer? We're having a hard time hearing.
Sorry,
Thank you.
I would like also to thank you for organizing this important hearing, which highlights the fact that the complexity and the magnitude of this problem makes it incumbent upon all of us to give full and serious attention to it. I'm here to offer the views of the Republic of Serbia, the chair country of the OSCE, as well as the country which is at the very center of the Western Balkan migration routes. Today's global migration scenario shows how migratory movements are driven often inseparably by traditional economic pull and push factors, as well as by instability and lack of security in a growing number of countries. The migrant crisis bursting through and over political, administrative, and civilization borders speaks tellingly of the interrelatedness of faraway countries and peoples, highlighting the consequent need for a responsible and energetic approach to the quest for a lasting and comprehensive solution to this burning issue. Partial and limited steps are not a solution. In the process of solving these problems, the support of all the member states of the most important multilateral organizations, including the OSCE, is of a paramount importance. The OSCE region is witnessing the largest influx of refugees in decades. Apart from being a significant economic challenge, this is a process with potentially very serious security implications and a cause of concern in regards to respect for human rights. As the international community is struggling to find responses that reconcile refugee protection and human rights commitments with security considerations, the OSCE, for its part, reflects on the role it could play in supporting the shared interests of its participating states and Mediterranean partners for cooperation. As the world's largest regional security arrangement under the Chapter 8 of the United Nations Charter, the OSCE is in a distinctive position to contribute to the handling and resolution of the crisis. Its comprehensive and multi-dimensional approach to the security is a unique asset. It is worth mentioning that the OSCE does not have a mandate to tackle the crisis directly. The organization is actually dealing with the security challenges which derive from the migrant crisis, primarily human trafficking, transnational criminal activities and threats, as well as border management. While the primary responsibility for these commitments lies with the participating states, the OSCE is mandated with reminding us for our commitments and assisting the participating states in implementing them. Traditionally, OSCE decisions have largely framed its mandate on migration within the second dimension. As a result, the Office of the Coordinator for Economic Environmental Activities has been tasked with assisting the implementation of OSCE commitments, particularly in the areas of comprehensive labor, migration management, gender aspect of the labor migration policies, as well as migration data collection and harmonization. Over the years, the OSCE has also widened its third dimension mandate, including issues related to migrant integration and the protection of human rights and of the vulnerable migrant groups. The Office of Democratic Institutions and Human Rights promotes the development and implementation of legal regulatory frameworks that respect the rights of migrants with special attention to the most vulnerable categories. In this context, I would like to underline that during the negotiations on the OSCE budget for 2015, Serbia, as a presiding country, has supported the proposal by the US, concretely the Helsinki Commission, to enhance activities in the field of fight against human trafficking through increasing the budget of the ODIHR. OSCE field operations have also been increasingly involved in migration-related activities and projects, although they have been unevenly mandated, reflecting the diversity of arrangements with host countries and different political priorities and needs. As the presiding country, Serbia recognizes the importance of these issues and is trying to provide more active and concrete approach to the OSCE in addressing them. In light of this bleak security situation and looming instability, it is paramount that all the mechanisms that were designed and adopted by the participating states to oversee the implementation commitments are strong and functioning. This year, the Serbian chairmanship has promoted a set of thematic discussions on migration and human trafficking, including in the framework of the OSCE Security Committee and the Mediterranean Contact Group. In May, the Serbian chairmanship co-organized with the OSCE Transnational Threats Department a 2015 OSCE annual police expert meeting, which focused on trafficking in human beings and irregular migrations within the context of the fighting against organized crime. At the initiative of our presidency, a joint meeting of the Security Committee on the Economic Environmental Committee and the Human Dimension Committee on Migration was held in Vienna on October 6th. As OSCE chair country, Serbia supports the position of the United States by which concrete ideas for OSCE activities in terms of migration crisis should be put into the context of the preparation for the upcoming Mediterranean Conference in Jordan, as well as the OSCE Ministerial Council in Belgrade. The Serbian chairmanship is pursuing a package of Ministerial Council decisions for the forthcoming meeting in Belgrade. As we start negotiating in the coming days, we intend to incorporate into the draft decisions as many concrete recommendations as possible. Mr. Chairman, allow me to point out that Serbia is not dealing with this crisis only in the capacity of the OSCE chair country. The migrant wave from the conflict-ridden areas has not bypassed my country. Although Serbia is not the final destination for most of the migrants and refugees, it has found itself at the very center of the Western Balkan migration route, and almost all migrants and refugees coming from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, and other unstable areas have transited through it, heading to the countries of the Western and Northern Europe. It is important to notice that the numbers of migrants on the Western Balkan route were constantly rising since 2009, and thus this is not a completely new problem. What is essentially new is that in the past few months, we are facing a dramatic increase in their numbers. From the beginning of this year, the Republic of Serbia has registered over 240,000 irregular migrants. The tendency is such that these numbers will only increase. The migrants who enter our territory are being registered and provided with accommodation, food, and medical care. The way in which we dealt with this pressure and in various aspects of the migrant crisis, namely our approach and empathy that was demonstrated so far, were very positively evaluated both by EU institutions and EU member countries, as well as the migrants themselves and by the Arab countries. However, it is obvious that the burden we bear during this crisis is becoming increasingly difficult. Specifically, aside from the financial costs of the current crisis, Serbia is for almost 2 decades now dealing with over 500,000 refugees and internally displaced persons from the wars from the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. In a nutshell, all of the experiences we had during this period have demonstrated that the solution for this crisis cannot be based on partial and local steps, such as closing borders or building fences. Cooperation and coordination within the international community is a must. It is necessary to reach a comprehensive and sustainable solution as soon as possible at the EU level to include also transit countries of the Western Balkan route. We wish to be part of this common solution, and we are already take our share of responsibility. I can assure you that Serbia will continue to be a credible EU partner and treat the migrants in a manner that is fully consistent with European and international standards. We are also committed to actively participating in the implementation of the agreed solutions. Aside from greater solidarity, there should be an increased willingness for a political response to the roots of the crisis. That means more readiness to seek a comprehensive solution and for creating conditions for sustainable peace and development in the region affected by the crisis. The alternative is much worse, and that could lead to further worsening of the situation that could grow into humanitarian crisis with hardly conceivable consequences. At the end, I would like to emphasize that although a small country, Serbia is ready to cooperate with the EU, the United States, the neighboring countries, and the international community in contributing to the peaceful and lasting solution. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking for your questions.
Ambassador Markovic, thank you very much for your testimony. I'd like to now yield the floor to Mr. Callahan.
Chairman Smith and esteemed members of the committee, thank you very much for calling this hearing together, particularly as it addresses the needs and safeties and well-being of hundreds of thousands of people. I am Sean Callahan, the Chief Operating Officer of Catholic Relief Services, which is the official overseas relief and development agency of the Catholic Church of the United States. And we serve 100 million people annually in over 100 countries throughout the world. We are also a member of Caritas International, which is a network of 200 different country offices throughout the world, and that is our natural partner network. I recently traveled to the Balkans to witness firsthand the response to the refugees that CRS was doing there. And CRS is currently working with many of its Caritas partners in the most affected countries. In a region that historically had religious strife, we found a great vibrancy in interreligious work there, and Catholic Relief Services working closely with the Catholic community, the Orthodox community, and the Muslim community to address the needs of the local communities as well as the migrants coming in. In addition to that, we're working very closely with the local governments and increasing that coordination as we move forward. I would also like to say that we're also receiving not only great generosity from people within the United States, but also of Islamic Relief and the Mormon Church here to have an interfaith effort too as far as the resources go, and this is supporting that effort in Europe. So we're using private funding to assist these people, and we've committed over $2 million in the coming year. I'd also like to give a nod to the ambassador, as in Serbia, we did notice firsthand, as I was on the border right between, in Šid, right on the border of Serbia and Croatia, where thousands of people had been this weekend, and we noticed the outpouring of the Serbian people, and frankly, I think Serbia could be an example in the way that many of the people there were coming together to assist the refugees. In some countries it seems to be pulling it apart, and in Serbia it's actually pulling people together. So I think we should highlight that great example of Serbia and maybe see if we can duplicate that in other areas. Who are the people that were coming and who are the people that we've seen? I think one of the examples was a young man named Khalid who came with his wife and his 4 children, who we saw on this no man's land border where many of the people rested. They rest between the border of Serbia and Croatia because they're afraid of being caught in one country or another, and so they were in the no man's land there. Their home had been bombed in Aleppo and completely destroyed. They were threatened in that community and had to leave. And we asked how they got here, and Khalid said, I was swimming alongside the boat with Rona wrapping her arms around me and clinging her head to my neck. It was a rubber boat and very slow, so I could keep pace. Rona is 2.5 years old. Khalid's 8-year-old daughter spoke up and told us proudly, my daddy is very strong. When we went from Syria to Turkey, he walked over hills and mountains, and most of the time he was carrying Jude and Rona in a backpack, and sometimes he carried me. So despite the generosity and hospitality of the governments of Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, the scale of the suffering and the need has outpaced their ability to respond to the refugee crisis, both from Syria and Iraq. CRS and our partners have assisted nearly 800,000 people and spent over 110 million in the last 3 years in response to this crisis. Some addressing the crucial immediate needs of people, but also trying to provide livelihoods to people so that they can eke out a life and so that they don't have to migrate. Although the Holy Father has called all of us to reach out to those people who do migrate, we are working very hard to work with the local countries and communities there to ensure that people don't have to migrate, that there is security and opportunity from them in these countries in the region. But the conflict has entered a new phase. Many have given up the idea of returning to Syria anytime soon. But unless their children can go to school and parents can provide for their families in the refugee host communities, then local integration is unrealistic. Many of the refugees in Lebanon and Jordan, particularly religious minorities, have not registered with the UN, and many are living outside with local communities, and as the assistance contracts, they move on to other locations. There's been many questions on why young men, and as they're coming, and we found that if a family member can find work, they will send back remittances. The rest of the family can remain in the region where the cultural and family ties and the cost of living make life easier. Similarly, the cost of transporting a whole family for many of these people at this time after 4 years of war is too great for them to transport the whole family, because many do have to pay traffickers to allow them to cross various borders. Similarly, the issue that you raised earlier, Mr. Chairman, conscription is a big issue. Those coming out of Syria cannot come out legally out of Syria. They have to sneak through the lines. They're either conscripted by the government or by a local rebel group. And so they sneak in and then try to get out of the local countries so that they're not sent back. As global leaders in the international humanitarian and refugee response, the U.S. and Europe must heed Pope Francis's call and find new ways to alleviate the suffering and protect the vulnerable. We at Catholic Relief Services and our partners with Caritas International throughout Europe give 6 different recommendations. The first recommendation, as the Holy Father has called, is let's work tirelessly and urgently to end the conflict. Stop the violence, stop the arming of these different groups that are going there, and stop the terrible efforts of ISIS. That the governments should galvanize greater support for a regional strategy to support medium-term integration of humanitarian and development assistance to the refugee host communities. We need to help the refugees not just survive, but thrive and integrate into the local communities. If we don't do that, then they will be on the move. We need to respond to the fluid situation in Europe, and we need to have BPRM be able to be a little bit more flexible to support agile international non-governmental organizations, because as we noticed, when I arrived in Belgrade, there were many people filling parks in the center city. Within the next week, they were bypassing Belgrade and going right to Šid. We need to have that agility so that we could set things up. It was fortunate that the international actors that were there could, within a moment's notice, shift their people to the border, and the opportunity in Serbia was ideal as the local population was providing assistance as well. We also would support that Congress robustly fund the humanitarian and development assistance as it has for the last 4 years at current or beyond current levels. And we do strongly support the Senate Emergency Supplemental Initiative to boost that effort and hope that the House would agree. We want to redouble our efforts at protection, and you brought this up, Mr. Chairman, particularly education for children. We find that it's crucially important for children to have education because it stops the abuse. You get to see the children, you get to view them at that time, and we have found many of the children require psychosocial help, and we've got innovative ways of working with puppets and others that allow the children to express the horrors they've seen, and frankly, it's allowed some of their parents to as well, because they have all suffered great violence. And then we would also ask the administration, as Senator Shaheen has said, to expedite and increase the number of refugees settled in the United States. 18 to 24 months means that these people will be on the road, will not see an opportunity in the future, and they need to know their future in the short term. Again, I thank you for hosting this hearing here, and happy to answer any questions.
So, Callahan, thank you very much. And now I'm very pleased to welcome Ambassador O'Sullivan.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for taking the initiative to organize this event, and thank you for the strong commitment which members of the Congress have shown, those here present and others who have traveled to the region, and we in Europe are very grateful for the interest and attention which you give to this very difficult issue. Mr. Chairman, it's already been a long afternoon. I've submitted a written statement. I suggested entered in the record. May I just make a few remarks so as not to take up too much time and allow for a more interactive discussion? As everyone has said, this is first and foremost a human tragedy. It is probably the worst humanitarian crisis in a generation. And as has been pointed out, it also is primarily a refugee crisis. This is extremely important in terms of the legal rights of the people involved. As Assistant Secretary Richard said, we in Europe don't have the luxury when people come knocking on the door seeking asylum of telling them to go away and let us think about it. They have to be received immediately. Because we have legal and international commitments which we take very seriously, which means that they must be granted immediate possibilities of shelter, of care, and the possibility to make their case and have their file processed. Now, we've been doing this for many, many years, and it has all worked extremely successfully, and Europe has been a major destination for asylum seekers and refugees. What has changed, frankly, is the scale and the numbers, which have simply overwhelmed the system. And I think to the extent there are deficiencies, it is because of that. And I would just like to remind people that I think there's been a great deal of compassion and humanity shown all across Europe. I think what the people of Italy have been doing, the people of Greece, when this crisis first hit through the Mediterranean, they've opened their homes, their town halls, their schools, they've provided shelter and food. They've shown great generosity and compassion. Islands like Lesbos, which I think has a population of 80,000 people, has seen 350,000 refugees transit. It's clearly unmanageable for these countries to face this kind of crisis. We acted immediately to try and stem the situation in the Mediterranean with the two naval forces that you've mentioned, a search and rescue operation which has saved nearly 120,000 lives, and an anti-smuggler naval operation designed to try and break the business model of the smugglers. This has to a certain extent stabilized the situation in the Mediterranean, but of course it has immediately created a new flow through the Western Balkans, which has now produced the crisis that we're now dealing with. And here we have tried to firstly help the member states of the European Union who are in the front line by offering to relocate asylum seekers from the frontline states. That's 160,000 people to be located elsewhere and whose files will be treated elsewhere in the European Union. We're offering assistance, technical assistance to the member states to help with the processing of the applications and also to help with the very difficult issue of returning those whose asylum claims are rejected. And this is a very difficult issue because it's complicated. But our processing for asylum seekers takes on average about 4 months. But at the end of that time, you do have to make some choices. People who are granted asylum have the right to stay. People who are not, we have to find out how they are dealt with and dealt with correctly. It's clear from all of this that the system which worked well in Europe for the last couple of years, notably the Dublin principle that the country of first arrival is the country that takes the responsibility, is no longer workable faced with this crisis. And since this crisis will probably continue, the Commission has made it clear we will need to rethink the system and will be making proposals both to have a permanent resettlement scheme, but also to have a revision of our asylum procedures so that in the future we can handle these kind of situations much more nimbly and much more effectively. Of course, it is very important, and this has been said many times, that the people we're experiencing in Europe as refugees are only a small percentage of the total number of displaced people. And I want to support everything that has been said about the need to support the neighboring countries, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and also other countries in the region who are experiencing difficulty and particularly the push factor, and I agree with everything that Assistant Secretary Richard said about the fall off of funding for the international agencies. The European Union and its member states, we're the largest donor of humanitarian assistance in the world. We're the largest donor of humanitarian assistance in this region and have been for the last 4 years. We have stepped up our assistance additionally. The United States is also a major donor. I think we are doing our share. I think we do need to insist that others do more in order to try and ensure that the conditions in which people are living in these countries enables them to have a decent existence and perhaps somewhat to reduce the pressure they may feel to move elsewhere. Also, we need a political solution to the sources of this conflict. Syria, obviously, an end to the violence, some political process to let the people of Syria rebuild their own future. We're fortunate that at least in Libya, which was a major transit problem due to the breakdown of law and order, there has been a positive political evolution. We hope we can build on that. So my major point, Mr. Chairman, is simply to say that this is certainly a crisis which is affecting Europe massively, but it is actually truly a global crisis, as the representative of UNHCR has said. And I think we do need a global effort. We're extremely grateful for all that the United States has done as a donor, as a political ally, but I think we all need to increase our efforts. We would hope that the United States will continue its diplomatic engagement with us and all relevant international partners to try and find a political solution to the root causes of the refugee crisis, reaching out to third countries, encouraging them to be more receptive to refugees, but also increasing the amount of money to the UN agencies, World Food Programme, UNHCR. There's desperate underfunding. We need a major international effort. We would be grateful if some consideration could be given to increasing the number of Syrian refugees taken in the United States. We're grateful for the numbers which have been mentioned. We would also appreciate if and we appreciate it's difficult and a sovereign decision of the United States, but some effort on reducing the processing time, which is indeed quite lengthy. We all need to push for increasing the funding through the UN system. So, Chairman, that's really all I will say in addition to my written submission. We're very grateful for this opportunity. It's a huge challenge. We really, in Europe, are very committed to facing this challenge. I think we can be very proud of much that has been done. Perhaps some things could have been done differently or better. I would not deny that. But we will continue to face this crisis with the full basis of our humanitarian values, our commitment to treating refugees fairly and decently, and to providing, hopefully, assistance where it's needed, but most importantly, political solutions which get to the root causes of why people flee their homes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador O'Sullivan. Let me, you mentioned increase the number of asylum slots or refugee slots. With all due respect, what do you think it ought to be?
Sir,
it's a tough question, but I don't.
No, any increase would be welcome. I mean, we appreciate this is a matter ultimately for the United States to decide, but clearly this problem is going to be with us for some time. We're going to have to find ways of offering these 11 million displaced people some possibilities of diverse places to build a future, and we hope that the United States could play its part in that.
Thank you. I'll ask all of you these questions and answer whichever ones you would like. But with winter fast approaching, obviously the threat of disease, people dying from exposure to cold and bad weather is increased markedly, particularly with so many people in transit. And I'm wondering if there's some early warning surveillance on how we might mitigate that threat. We're always worried about a breakout of a new pandemic, and obviously that looms large, I think, in the affected region, with so many people potentially going to get sick. And maybe, Mr. Callahan, you might want to speak to what you're finding and what others are finding, and all of you might want to speak to this, in terms of diseases, the morbidity as well as the fatality rates. We know that children are less likely to be getting their immunizations. We know that other opportunistic infections will seize upon all of this transition and all of this chaos, and people do get sicker in more torn areas. If you might want to speak to that, I would appreciate it. I would ask you also, do Christians and those of other religious minorities face any unique challenges not faced perhaps by the Sunni or by the Shia? We know that in some refugee camps, some of the Christians are less likely to be housed there, that there are problems sometimes with an integration issue. So I'm wondering if they are left further behind when it comes to refugee protection and asylum seeking. Do they have unique problems? The WFP shortfall, the World Food Program shortfall, if that were to be alleviated quickly, and other humanitarian gaps that exist, as Mr. Pitterman pointed out so well, would that likely lead to stemming the number of people who are uprooting, or has this now become a movement that is going to run its course, so to speak, as people just leave? And again, I thought your two mega trends coupled with the trigger, I think so well put it. People don't expect this war to end anytime soon. They have spent down to the point of gross impoverishment, and now in comes the WFP cuts and the other cuts that have just made life beyond miserable. But if that were reversed, if the humanitarian crisis from that point of view were to be very robustly attacked, what would happen there? You mentioned, Ambassador O'Sullivan, about the Dublin regulation, and we all know that means, you know, the country where they first make their presence are the ones who need to adjudicate whether or not they're asylum eligible. But we all know that some of the countries have a less capability in that area. And I know that our own Director of Intelligence, Clapper, our FBI Director, Comey, the Special Presidential Envoy for Global Coalition to Counter ISIL, Allen, have all publicly expressed concerns about terrorist groups like ISIS posing as refugees, especially at those European countries where there might be a less capable effort to weed them out. And I'm wondering, you did indicate that that's being looked at. It seems to me that would be if you could elaborate on where that might go. And finally, I guess that's enough for now, if you could.
Let me perhaps focus in on the question regarding what would happen if the funding pipeline was replenished in WFP and everybody was able to respond to the needs of the refugees in the countries of asylum. So in the principal countries of Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, to a lesser extent Egypt. I think that the answer is that people would continue to flee from Syria. There would continue to be internal displacement. The attacks of this last days in Aleppo are said to have generated 70,000 new people moving. So it wouldn't stem the tide once again because they're refugees. They would simply perhaps be less compelled to leave their first countries of asylum to go to Europe or elsewhere. But it wouldn't relieve the pressure on the international community to still provide support to the host countries in a bigger and better way, in a more sustained and multi-year manner, rather than year to year. Actually, it's quarter to quarter humanitarian assistance. And it would perhaps also focus more attention on the legal avenues for people to leave Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey through resettlement, through family reunification and other means, which would allow for a more managed, predictable approach to arrival in Europe as well as to the United States. That's the best case scenario.
And before the rest of you answer, if you could, and maybe you would want to touch on this as well, with regards to human trafficking and the exploitation of women, are there assessments being undertaken to look at the situations where women are more vulnerable? I have a whole list of places. I mentioned Munich as just one of those where women have been raped and they've been sold into slavery. And we all know how the exploiters just have a capability to find these women and sell them and reduce them to commodities. And I know we all care about it. I know, the European Union has done yeoman's work on combating these crimes. But I'm wondering if, given all of the chaos, if enough is being done and your recommendations on that.
Very good. I know for a fact that this is a matter of particular interest to UNHCR and to our partners and to the states. There's no question about that. I don't have with me specific references, but we can certainly furnish them to the committee when I get back to the.
I'd appreciate that very much.
If I may answer two of your questions regarding the disease which you have mentioned and the bad weather which is coming. Of course, it is a great concern in Serbia. We are trying to assist the refugees as much as possible and trying to give them accommodation, food, and warm clothes, because most of them, they are coming from areas where there is no that harsh winter conditions. So we are trying to do that, but of course Serbia's capacities are limited. So that's why we need the assistance from the European Union, and I'm thankful that the EU has allocated already 1.5 million euros for these purposes, but actually we need more. We have established some refugee centers and registration centers on the borders with Macedonia, with Bulgaria, and also on the leaving side towards Hungary and Croatia. As far as these diseases are concerned, yes, they are present, and there are medical experts who can aid these refugees currently in Serbia. Although I have to stress that the destination country of most of them is not Serbia. They are just in transit. The average stay in Serbia is about 3 to 4 days. So that limits actually the possibility that there are some diseases, although it happened that people were sick, and even some of them died, and also women giving birth to children, but all of these were taken care by the medical team. And the other question which you have mentioned regarding the treatment of the various nationalities and religions in Serbia, all of them are treated equally. So never, if they are Sunnis or Shia or Christians, it is no difference. We are treating them with dignity, and we are welcoming them and trying to help them, because Serbian people were also in the past subjected to some situations similar to this, and we really understand their plight and then why they are leaving their own country. So if it would be the situation, my opinion is that we have to work together, the whole international community, with the lead of the United States, to solve the crisis at the roots, and in that way the number of the refugees will be much smaller. Thank you.
Just to pick up on those 2 points, winterization, it is something that we're working on right now, getting proper clothing and structures in place, because as we see, and they need to be portable structures because of the points of migration constantly changing. So we're looking at that, as well as bathrooms in some of the host countries with the porta potties and things like that. We have had medical teams out, and there is an increase in respiratory diseases, skin diseases, as you might imagine, because people haven't been able to bathe in weeks. We're talking to families that have been going for 10 weeks at a time, and so those are very difficult. I think, in some of these circumstances, you do have to worry about, on the longer term, if you get more and more people packed in some of these no man's land, the issues of other diseases spreading will be more rapid. I would just, to jump on the issue of the Christians, we haven't noticed as much in the current migration, but certainly when Christians have left both Syria and Iraq, they are not going into camps because, frankly, they don't trust those communities and are integrating into local communities where they have someone that they know that they can trust in those areas. And I'd say that's both for Christians and Yazidis. They also aren't seeking the same refugee protection because they're outside of that. And you mentioned the issue of trafficking. I think not only is there an issue of trafficking of women, but because of the vulnerability of the refugees, children are much more susceptible. The parents go out doing things, they leave children behind for someone to take care of, and we found more and more cases of children being abused, which is just heartbreaking. And so it's one of those cases that, to get them out of these situations, we need to make sure that they have emergency schooling and that they have caregivers that provide that opportunity so their families aren't vulnerable.
Chairman, on your point about the Dublin Agreement, and as you say, just for those not familiar with the jargon, it means within the European Union, the first country where a person claims asylum is the country that processes the application and looks after the person while that is happening. Clearly, and this used to work quite well, and I don't think there was a problem of technical ability of any country to process such asylum seekers until we got to the point of large numbers where the system has now been overwhelmed. And also, as the ambassador of Serbia said, in many cases, people don't want to stay in the first country where they've arrived. They actually want to go somewhere else. So the struggle now is simply to have some form of registration, some fingerprinting, some minimum photographing, and then allowing them to travel on. So that's why we will certainly need to revisit this as the basic principle of asylum seeking in Europe. I don't know exactly what the Commission will come forward as an alternative, but clearly in the short term we are giving strong assistance to member states who feel overwhelmed with the numbers they have to deal with, to help them cope better with the numbers and process the claims better. On the security issue, I mean, you discussed this at some length with Assistant Secretary Richards. I don't want to say that there is no risk. But to be very frank, the calculation on the European security level, and this is not a European competence, it's a national competence, but they generally feel that this is not a high risk at the moment. Frankly, the terrorist acts we've had in Europe have often come from homegrown terrorists. And there are other easier ways for people to get into Europe if they want to as terrorists than disguising themselves as refugees and having to accept to be fingerprinted and photographed. So I'm not so sure that this has to be our major concern. I'm not saying that we do not need to be aware of it. I'm not saying that the security forces, I'm quite sure, are keeping a close eye on the people who are claiming asylum and whose files are now with them with fingerprints and photographs. And I'm not saying that we may not develop problems in the future, particularly if we're unable to integrate these people who are granted asylum and who may become alienated in our societies. Then I think we could face some challenges. But I think in the immediate term, this is doesn't have to be our major concern, and I think we need to allay public fears rather than fuel them. And I agree entirely with Mr. Callahan about the young men. I think those of us who are of Irish origin remember well that it was often easier for an income earner to be the first person to move and to leave the family behind, and then to send money back, or eventually to seek family unification when you'd actually built up a livelihood. And it's a fairly tough journey from those countries to anywhere in Europe, and I'm not surprised that it's young, fit men who feel more able to make it than people with families or that man who was carrying his children on his shoulder. So I think that those are just some elements I would put into the discussion.
Just if I could follow up, if you would mind. There have been reports that funding for Macedonia, which is obviously an area that's been, very much impacted by the inflow, is inadequate. Is that something the European Union is looking at to beef that up? Because so many people have come in through Macedonia.
Well, I mean, we are firstly trying to deal with, the influx coming onto the European Union territory, for which we're legally responsible. But we are working very closely with all the neighbouring countries, because we understand that, as the UNHCR representative said, I mean, nobody thinks that you can build a wall and stop this, but it is a question of how you can manage it and how you can avoid that trying to fix it in one place, you simply spill the problem over into a neighboring country and then into another neighboring country. That's why we really need an integrated effort across the region with good cooperation between us and also financial burden sharing to help everyone contribute to helping this to be done in the most humane and correct way vis-a-vis the refugees, and hopefully in due course to slow down the flow and persuade people that maybe they don't have to rush to get inside the European borders. There is a better future which may be elsewhere for them.
Commissioner Shaheen.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you both for being here this afternoon and for the work that you're doing to address this crisis. I want to first agree with the statements that have been said. What I saw when I was in Europe was a tremendous outpouring of native people in Greece, in Germany, heard of that, and other places where people were trying to respond to the humanitarian effort, and while they were overwhelmed, they were trying to do the right thing, and I think people deserve a lot of credit for that. I'm sure in Serbia that's also the case. And I think certainly leadership from countries like Germany to say that this is a crisis that we should all respond to is important to recognize, and we met with the Coast Guard in Greece, who often at great personal risk had rescued literally thousands of people from the Mediterranean who were saved because of that heroism. I also agree with everything that's been said about the need to support Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan, because they have certainly taken in so many refugees. And Mr. Callahan, thank you for putting a face on these refugees. We talked to some young men in a settlement house in Berlin who were students who had fled, wanted to continue their education, and wanted to go back to Syria because they wanted to be the future leaders of that country. I have three just questions before we close this afternoon, and the first has to do, Ambassador, with one of the things that surprised me in Germany was hearing how many of the refugees who had come there were from the Balkans, mostly from Albania and Kosovo, and appreciating the history in the Balkans. You may want to hand that question off to somebody else, but can you talk about why you think we're seeing those large numbers of refugees from the Balkans most of this discussion today has focused on Africa and the Middle East, but in fact, we are seeing those refugees. And what is the response to those folks who have left those Balkan countries?
Thank you, Senator, for this question. And yes, you are right that a big number of refugees have left recently the Balkans, mainly from Kosovo, Albania, but also from some other countries. The reason, I think, is more economic, that the economic hardships, the lack of jobs, the high level of unemployment, and in a kind lack of perspective for their future lives. So they think that they will find a better life in Western Europe, and that it will be their future. But in order to solve this problem, I think we have to work together, and all these countries in the region should be united on an agenda to promote the economic relations with all the Western European countries and the United States, and to attract more investment, to create conditions for more foreign investments. Once they have a better life there and they have possibilities for jobs and livelihood there, they will stay. So the root problem in the Balkans is economic reasons, not like in Syria or in other countries. But yes, I can compare it with some African countries who are also leaving for economic reasons. My Prime Minister, Mr. Vučić, and thank you very much for receiving him last time he was here, has a really very good agenda on the regional reconciliation with the countries. That's why his first visit after elected as Prime Minister was to Bosnia-Herzegovina, to show our support to the united and one country, Bosnia-Herzegovina. And also he visited, as you know, Albania twice, and the Albanian Prime Minister, Mr. Edi Rama, was in Belgrade. So this regional reconciliation and the program which we are doing is, I think, the solution of the whole problem.
And I certainly applaud that leadership and very much appreciate it. One of the things that we heard was we know that many of the African migrants are coming across through Libya, as has been talked about. Many coming from Turkey across the Mediterranean to Greece. One of the things that we heard was that there are traffickers operating out of Turkey, and that there is the potential to help crack down on those traffickers in a way that would help with the problem. To what extent do you all see the international community or the EU working with Turkey to try and address those traffickers who are contributing to immigration? Mr. Pitterman? Or Ambassador O'Sullivan?
I think the consensus is I should answer that question, Senator. I mentioned the naval mission that we put in place, and I don't know if there is a legal difference between smugglers and traffickers, but basically both types of activity are at work here. And it is clear that in the early stages of this crisis, this was particularly true in Libya, people paying large sums of money to come a very convoluted route and then being put on unseaworthy vessels, pushed out to sea, and then phone calls to the Italian Coast Guard to say a boat's going to sink if you don't rescue it. Extremely cynical and dangerous. And we have put in place this naval mission, which basically will operate across the whole Mediterranean with a mandate. We've now got we're very grateful to the United States for the support for that, a UN mandate to operate on the high seas. We would hope that we could reach an agreement with a new Libyan administration also to help them address this issue on their shores. And we're engaged in conversations with Turkey, as you know, actively now to see how we can jointly work with them to try and deal with this issue of illegal movement into Greece, which you've been able to witness at first hand. So yes, I mean, I think we're actively engaged. We have a naval force that's out there trying to make some inroads. It's not easy. And I think we need to deal with the smugglers. Of course, it will not, once again, this is dealing with a symptom, right. But we need to deal with it. But we will still, the bigger problem will still remain. But this is one aspect I think we definitely need to address.
Yes, one of the things that we heard is that as migrants were put into the big rubber boats, and that's exactly what they are, big rubber rafts, that they were told when they get close to the shore to cut them so they will begin to sink, so that the Coast Guard would come and rescue them. As you point out, this is, whether it's the smugglers or whether it's humanitarian efforts, it's a response to the immediate challenge. The longer term challenge is how do we address the conflicts that are causing, or the economic conditions that are causing the refugees, but also what about the reintegration efforts? Because one of the things that we heard was that that's a longer term challenge. It's probably a more expensive in the long term challenge, and it's one in which often members of EU countries are more concerned about addressing, and certainly the United States has seen that here in terms of the immigration challenges that we have in the United States. So can you speak to, Ambassador O'Sullivan, what the discussions at the EU and what you are looking at that will address that longer term reintegration challenge, and how that is being looked at across EU member states?
Well, we have a long history of migration within Europe. Almost every European country has significant populations, either from within Europe in previous generations, or from North Africa or Turkey. 3 million Turks living in Germany, very substantial North African populations living in France and Belgium. Even in more recent times, my own country, Ireland, has now got 250,000 Poles living there, and some 60,000 Chinese, I believe. So the world has changed, and I think we are conscious that in some cases the integration of these communities has been more successful than others. And I think people are very conscious that looking forward, and we can now assume, I think, that we are going to have a fairly consistent flow of refugees and asylum seekers and possibly even economic migrants that we're going to have to face and deal with. I mean, we'd like to deal with the root causes. We'd like to feel that people didn't have to come. But on the other hand, we also have a demographic situation, which maybe would mean that we actually might have economic needs for migrants. And I think people are very conscious of trying to think through now, how do we ensure the integration? How do we ensure language training, access to education? President Juncker, the President of the Commission, made a very strong appeal that all of these asylum seekers should be allowed work, which is not necessarily the case for people with pending applications for asylum, because he said not only the dignity of work, but the integration and the sense of belonging to a community. So I think, yes, there's a lot of thought going into it. We're dealing with the immediate crisis, but the next phase is definitely, well, given that these people are now here and probably will continue to come, perhaps in slightly smaller numbers, but it doesn't matter. We really need in each member state to have a conscious policy of how we make sure that they are successfully integrated into our respective societies, yes.
So we will stay tuned for
yes,
further decisions at the EU level?
Unfortunately, it's not something that you see the results of 2 days afterwards. You know, I think we need to stay tuned and come back in 5 years' time to see how successful we've been.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman Smith, for holding the hearing.
Thank you very much, Commissioner.
If I may just
Mr.
add a
Chairman,
quick
sure,
word on
please.
this point, because UNHCR has been quite proactive, I think, together with other resettlement countries to help promote dialogue, to provide a convening for that. And the U.S. has quite a lot to learn from the resettlement experience in Europe. But up until now, that experience has been very much the social welfare state model, dealing with tens, hundreds of people. Now, au contraire, they're confronted with quite important numbers of refugees being resettled or relocated within Europe, much alike the American model. And so, as Assistant Secretary Richards said, they're also asking questions, and the United States can provide, I think, some very helpful answers with the imperative to work. But the United States hasn't really set up standards for citizenship. We don't know how many refugees who've been resettled have become citizens of the United States. And the other data indicators aren't always very clearly available. But the main thing now that's happening, I see, is a lot more engagement by, for example, the Migration Policy Institute, where they're having experts in integration of refugees and immigrants in Europe speaking to Americans to learn more about how things are happening and where there are lessons to be learned. But it will be a long-term thing. A lot of what we've been talking about today, if I may just, as a sort of summary closure remark from my side, prompt that first, the refugee is, like you said, a symptom of the problem. They are victims. They're not choosing to go. They're not, while they may be of economic importance, that's not their primary motivation, after all. But what we're in for now is the long term, whether it's, and it's big bucks, frankly, in terms of reconstruction in Syria, when there is a solution, and Iraq, in terms of development assistance to the host countries in the interim, and also to encourage other middle-income asylum countries like Tunisia and Kenya and Ethiopia and Cameroon to continue to provide asylum to literally hundreds of thousands of refugees, very much at their expense, because there's no way that UNHCR is able to support host communities at the same level as we provide support to refugees, and that there will be, therefore, a continuing need for development aid. And it's a big challenge ahead of us, and I think we're talking Marshall Plan.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to concluding? Thank you so much for your expertise, your extraordinary commitment to humanity, which is played out every single day. You've provided this commission with a tremendous number of insights and recommendations that we will work on as individual members of the Senate and the House, but also as a commission. So thank you so very much. The hearing is adjourned.